is the Secretary of State aware that the government's plan to put a £30,000 salary floor on migrants entering the UK will massively damage the tourism industry in the Lake District and the Yorkshire Dales, leaving many unable to fill vital positions? Myself and representatives of the tourism industry have spoken to ministers past and present on this matter about the need to massively lower that figure. Will she listen?
Well, I hope that the Honourable Gentleman, Right Honourable Gentleman, will know that I am a minister that always listens, and I know that he represents a very beautiful part of the world in the Lake District, which I have been delighted to enjoy the benefits of through many different visits. I am very aware of this issue. It is something that's obviously under active consideration. One of the things post the 1st November is that the UK will be able to set its own immigration policy that's right for this country, and we're very aware that the tourism sector is very reliant both on domestic talent but also recruiting from overseas.
Philip Oliver.
Kettering may not be the first place you think of when it comes to tourism, but in the and you'd be wrong, because located in the beating heart of the East Midlands, right in the middle of the town, is Wicksteed Park, which is the first ever leisure park in the UK devoted to children's play. It attracts 800,000 visitors a year and is supported by the Heritage Lottery Fund. Celebrating its centenary in 2021, will the Secretary of State ensure that Wicksteed Park is at the forefront of her mind whenever she considers tourism?
Well, can I thank my honourable friend very much indeed. As he knows, Kettering is very much in my heart, because I go through it at least twice a week on the East Midlands or East Midlands train service up and down to my constituency. I'm delighted to hear about Wicksteed Park. I'm delighted to hear it's supported by the Heritage Lottery Fund, and I think actually goes to this heart of the fact that there are some real treasures up and down the country, and that importance of place and making sure that we invest in it.
Gavin Newlands.
Number 2, sir.
Minister Warman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tackling disinformation is a key government priority, and in our online harms white paper we seek to take a world-leading approach to doing just that, and we also seek within that to develop a media literacy strategy that tackles it both in terms of the people who are reading it as well.
Mr. Newlands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Civil servants have said they cannot see how the data being gathered by gov.uk would help with Brexit preparations, and with the Cambridge Analytica scandal still fresh in the memory, along with the arrogant refusal by Dominic Cummings to assist their department in any way with its inquiry, does he not see that another mass data gathering exercise in the run-up to an election is a huge red flag for all those worried about a free and fair process?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think it's important to say within this context that what the government is doing via the Brexit website or via any other website is, firstly, nothing out of the ordinary, and secondly, actually serves a very useful purpose in making sure that we, just like businesses, know our users.
Jeremy Wright.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and can I warmly welcome my honourable friend and his fellow ministers to their leadership roles in this remarkable department. And can I urge him to translate the online harms white paper into legislation as swiftly as possible, and invite him to agree with me that doing so is not just good for the United Kingdom, because it will create a regulator with the authority to enforce a proper duty of care on online companies, but will also be an act of global leadership, whether other countries are acting as swiftly as us or not.
Minister Warman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I should begin by paying tribute to the great work that my right honourable friend did overseeing the birth of the online harms white paper, and he is completely right. We should be proud in this House that it is an open liberal democracy such as the United Kingdom that seeks to lead the way on what is an immensely difficult area. He is right to say that we should move quickly, but we should also move at a pace that allows us to get this vital issue correct.
Joe Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the Secretary of State to her position, and I'm looking forward to her appearing at our Select Committee on the 16th of October. She will know that we undertook a very large inquiry into fake news and disinformation, at which the Prime Minister's Chief Advisor refused to attend and is in contempt of Parliament. Would she like to bring Mr Dominic Cummings along on the 16th of October with her?
Minister.
I hesitate to speak on behalf of the Secretary of State in every aspect of that, but I am confident that she doesn't need to bring a man to answer questions for her.
William Byrne.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What would be a world-class regime for shutting down fake news and disinformation would be if we had courts that were actually accessible in the fight against misbehaviour by big tech. The breakthrough in the Court of Appeal yesterday, in the case of Richard Lloyd, shows just how hard it is to bring to account big tech firms like Google, who have clearly misbehaved. So when he does bring the online harms bill to this House, and he might tell us when he expects that to happen, will he look again at the proposals we tabled during committee stage to actually make it far, far easier to bring class actions against some of the biggest firms on earth? He has the chance to level the legal playing field against big tech. Will he tell the House that he's determined to seize it?
Minister.
I thank you for that question. We are absolutely determined to tackle these vital issues because we know that the behaviour of social media companies is not always acting in the best interests of all our constituents. Of course, we'll look at any proposals that are put forward by the party opposite, but I think it is also important to say that we need to get this right, and that does require us to work with industry as well as against them.
Jeff Smith.
Question 3, sir.
Secretary of State.
It's the responsibility of the football authorities to govern the sport and provide assurances to fans that proper protections are in place. We welcome the EFL's financial and sustainability review and stand ready to support and feed into it as appropriate.
Mr. Smith.
Mr. Speaker, football clubs are not just economic or even sporting entities. They are, as we've seen in the sad case of Bury, often the heart of their communities and of key significance in the lives of individual fans, without whom they are nothing. So would the Minister support legislating to give fans a right to be represented in boardrooms to gain more influence over their clubs?
Secretary of State.
Well, can I thank the Honourable very much indeed for his question. Mr. Speaker, I should have said that the Minister for Sport, Media and Creative Industries is very sorry not to be here. He's given apologies, I think, both to your office and also to the opposition front bench, but he's overseas on departmental business. I entirely agree with the Honourable Gentleman about the importance of local football clubs and their place in the community and the importance of bringing people together. We are obviously open to dialogue, and we know how strongly people, fans feel about their investment in the clubs. We want to see how this EFL review goes and whether in fact there are some wider questions to be asked too.
Gareth Thomas.
Further to my honourable friend's question, the Premier League clubs and the Football Association have been resisting the idea of a supporter elected to the board of football clubs for a very long time. Why should the current EFL review be any different?
Well, can I thank the Honourable Gentleman? We have, of course, seen that what's happened to Bury and very nearly happened to Bolton over this summer. We know how strongly people feel about this. I think we need to let that EFL review happen. But as I say, it may be that there are some wider questions that we should be asking too.
Vicky Ford.
Question 4, please.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Online abuse is unacceptable and far too prevalent. Close to half of UK adults say that they have seen hateful content in the last year alone. As has already been mentioned, we published the Online Harms White Paper in April. It tackles both legal legal but harmful and also illegal content, including hate crime, harassment and cyber stalking. And we said seek to bring it forward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Recent events have highlighted the high levels of online abuse faced by members of Parliament, especially women, and the threats of violence and intimidation towards those in public life undermines democracy and cannot be acceptable. The Joe Cox Foundation is calling on all political parties to commit to a joint standard of conduct to uphold the highest standards of public life. Does my honourable friend support this initiative?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I pay tribute not only to the work that my honourable friend has done on this area, but to the work that the Foundation is doing. And she is right that we should cross-party seek to do all that we can, not only to discourage the abuse that she speaks of, but also to encourage people to come into politics. And of course, that will not happen so long as the level of abuse is as it is. And we will, of course, look closely at the proposals as well as those others that have come forward.
Ian Lucas.
Has he or anyone in his department had discussions with the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster concerning these matters since the Chancellor was appointed?
Minister.
I have discussed aspects of this with the Minister for the Cabinet Office, who obviously reports directly to the Chancellor for the Duchy of Lancaster, and I will continue to do so.
Mr. Peterborough.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister says the abuse is unacceptable, and he's right. I mean, when I have a picture of my, some time ago, young son being executed on the internet, but nobody seems to be able to do anything whatsoever about it. We say it's unacceptable, but we don't seem to be able to do anything about it. What's the Minister's ideas?
Minister.
He is completely right that as things stand, we are not able to take the action that we should be able to, and I think it's also important to say that social media companies themselves have also not taken the action that is required of them in a civilised society. The Online Harms White Paper and its journey into legislation will be a crucial method for tackling this, but it is not the only one, and I would like to continue to work with those social media companies to bring forward much more rapid progress.
Tom Watson.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker, and can I welcome the Secretary of State to her new role, and on behalf of my team welcome her whole team to their new roles too. The Cybersecurity Fund forms part of this government's approach to combating harmful online activity, but serious doubts have been raised about the fund's management. Given the concern, can the Minister or the Secretary of State confirm today whether Hacker House is a UK-based company?
Minister.
As the honourable gentleman knows, this is a subject that we discussed in an urgent question earlier on. As far as Companies House is concerned, as far as all the due diligence that was done at the time, then Hacker House met all of the criteria. He also knows, however, that we are looking into this matter, and that review will report to the House by the end of this month.
Tom Watson.
Mr. Speaker, last week the Minister made a statement to the House in which he gave the impression that Hacker House was UK-based when he referred to a UK phone number owned by the company. My team phoned it and it was answered by a woman in California. He mentions Companies House. I looked at the Companies House website this morning and see that there has been a registration detail change, that one of the principal directors now registers their state of residence as the United States. And so I remain concerned, not least because Hacker House's accounts show a receipt of a loan of £700,000 from one of the company's directors. Can he assure us that this unusual transaction was not used to unlock a taxpayer-funded government scheme?
Very good question. Minister.
I can assure the honourable gentleman that we are having a review that will look into all these matters, and I can also say that, as he knows, the residence of an individual director is not one of the defining characteristics of whether a company is based in the UK or not.
Rachel Maskell.
Number 5, please.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask this question along with question 10. The Government is very disappointed with the BBC's decision on the future of the TV licence concession. We know that older people in particular value television as a source of companionship, entertainment and a way to stay connected with the world. I've met with the chairman of the BBC board and the Director General of the BBC, and I've asked them to do more to help those affected by the decision.
Rachel Maskell.
Mr. Speaker, promises matter, but when you're elderly, when you're lonely, when you're housebound, you're not interested in squabbling in this place. You're not interested in excuses. You want that promise honoured and your free TV licence. So can the Secretary of State say why she made a promise at the election, why she's letting down older people across the country and what she's going to do about it?
Secretary of State.
Well, of course, it's not a promise that I made because I've only taken this job in July, but she's right to say that there was a commitment. There was also an agreement with the BBC in the 2015 funding settlement. We committed to increase the licence fee in line with inflation and closing the iPlayer loophole. But she's right to say that actually the people are not interested in squabbling in this place, whether it's about TV licences or about anything else indeed. If older people are entitled to pension credit, then they will get the help they need. And as I say, the BBC will also be working to make sure that others are aware of that entitlement and other support available.
Ms Twist.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We're in the midst of a loneliness epidemic. For many older people, television is their main source of company. And for those who are housebound and can't get out of the house or live on their own, it's a window to the wider world. There are 5,170 households in my constituency of Blaydon who look set to lose their free TV licences, which they were promised by the government at the last election. Does the Minister agree with me that you can't means test for social isolation?
Yeah. Well, as the Honourable Lady also knows, we are the first government in the world to appoint a minister to lead work on tackling loneliness, and last year we published the world's first government strategy on loneliness, as well as securing £20 million of new grant funding for projects run by charities and community groups to bring people together. We know that there are people who are not claiming the pension credit who would be entitled and would fall into the categories that she's mentioned. I hope that she, like me, as a local MP, will work with all local agencies to make sure everyone entitled to that support gets it.
Martin Day.
Number 6.
Secretary of State.
Mr Speaker, the Government firmly believes in press freedom. Clearly, that freedom comes with a responsibility to ensure it is not abused. It is not unreasonable to expect the press to act with understanding in relation to sensitive personal stories. It's not for government to arbitrate, but it's important we have systems in place so individuals can take complaints to independent bodies so they can be assessed.
Martin Day.
Thank you. Last month saw yet another example of a high-profile sports figure having to deal with tabloid newspapers publishing deeply personal and distressing information about his family's private lives. Leveson was supposed to change the way such publications operated, but would she agree with me that incidents like this seem to suggest that it is just business as usual, with sales and profit being put before individuals' rights to privacy?
Well, can I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his question. We obviously, I think all of us, have complete empathy with the strong feelings both of Ben Stokes, which I think is the story that he is referring to, but also Gareth Thomas, who of course had a similar invasion of privacy in the very same week. Now, decisions on whether the press's action in those cases were in breach of their agreed standards should be made by the independent regulatory bodies. The press said they wanted to be self-regulated. I wait to see in these particular examples, if complaints are made, how that self-regulation works.
Alex Norris.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In March last year, the now Secretary of State for Health stood at that dispatch box and asked the second part of the Leveson inquiry because he said the culture in the media had changed. Well, we look at the Duchess of Sussex, of Gareth Thomas and of Ben Stokes, and we see that the culture of invasion of privacy hasn't changed. The Secretary of State says it's not for the government to arbitrate such matters, so will she now resurrect the independent inquiry and let us properly move this forward?
Secretary of State.
Well, can I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his question, but I don't agree, because I think the media landscape has changed significantly in the 6 years since the Leveson inquiry was first published. We believe the steps that we have taken mean that continuing with Part 2 is no longer appropriate, proportionate or in the public interest.
Anna Bardell.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The family of my Livingston constituent, Kirsty Maxwell, have faced the unimaginable tragedy of losing her in suspicious circumstances in Benidorm in 2017 when she fell to her death from a balcony. To compound this horror, they have since had to face repeated violations of their privacy and intrusion from some journalists and media outlets. Does she agree with me that we have a duty of care to our citizens, especially those who have been traumatised and faced a loss of this magnitude, to protect their privacy and the memory of their loved ones? And will she meet with me to discuss this and the recommendations that will be in my upcoming report on deaths abroad and support for families when they face media intrusion?
Well, can I thank the Honourable Lady very much indeed. Of course, I'd be very happy to meet with her to discuss this, and I'm very sorry for everything that's happened to Kirsty's family and friends after this unimaginable tragedy. I hope that we perhaps at the meeting can discuss whether in fact complaints have been made and how that system of self-regulation has worked in that case.
Richard Graham.
Number 7, please, sir.
Minister Helen Whately.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. There is overwhelming evidence from academics and respected organisations like Historic England that heritage-led regeneration provides substantial economic and social benefits. So, last month, we were delighted to announce a £95 million investment in High Street Heritage Action Zones, which will support ambitious projects to revive our historic high streets, boosting local economies and quality of life all around the country. And I would like to congratulate my honourable friend on his constituency's successful bid for £1.9 million as part of this scheme to revitalise Gloucester's Cathedral Quarter.
Graham.
Mr. Speaker, this government has done wonders for heritage regeneration, and I am grateful for the Minister's confirmation of the successful bid by Gloucester's Cathedral Quarter for the Heritage Action Zone Fund, which will enable the medieval Fleece Hotel to be regenerated after 2 decades of sitting shut. My honourable friend knows that culture is also important for inspiring young people to stay and work in small cities. Would she consider setting up a small pot for the unsuccessful but 15 runners-up to the Cultural Development Fund?
Well, my honourable friend is a tremendous campaigner for heritage funding in his constituency. In fact, since he's been MP for Gloucester, his constituency has secured over £15 million from the National Lottery Heritage Fund and now close to £2 million for a Heritage Action Zone. But clearly he wants more. So he asked about the Cultural Development Fund, which also supports use of culture and heritage as a catalyst for regeneration and economic growth. The government is monitoring the success of the Cultural Development Fund and will in due course consider whether there will be future rounds of the fund.
Chairman.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know if the Minister is aware of this, that we value heritage a great deal in Huddersfield. We have more listed buildings than Gloucester, Bath or York. But we are very keen to have our fair share of the money for regeneration through that process. And also, could she actually look at some of the people high up in English heritage that seem to want to stop any positive forward-looking project if they don't like it?
I thank the honourable member for his question, and I believe that his constituency was indeed successful in securing some support from the Heritage High Street Action Zone scheme. So I congratulate his constituency on that, and I look forward to seeing that make a positive impact in his area.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question number 8.
Minister.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to group questions 8 and 14. The UK's creative, digital and media industries are a global success story. Our creative industries continue to outperform the wider economy. Their value is up from £95 billion in 2016 to £102 billion in 2017. As Europe's leading tech hub, we generate more billion-dollar tech businesses than any other country in Europe. We have maintained a dialogue with the creative industries on EU exit over the last 3 years. I recognise the movement of people and goods amongst their concerns, but the UK is a global leader in these sectors, and our decision to leave the EU will not change that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I refer the House to my entry in the Register of Members' Interests. Can the Minister guarantee that musicians and others in the creative industries, with their roadies and techies, will be able to work across the EU, as they do now, as they need to make a living, if we leave, with or without an agreement, taking their instruments, their kit and their merchandise in a system that works across borders without carnets or additional costs, as they do now?
I thank the honourable member for the question. And we are talking to the industry about exactly these concerns. I have already had some conversations along these lines, as has the Secretary of State who met UK Music earlier this week. It is true that when the UK leaves the EU on the 31st of October, free movement as it currently stands will end. In the event of a no deal exit, creative professionals will need to check if they need a visa or work permit for the EU country they're visiting. But I am very optimistic that we should get a deal, and I would encourage the honourable member to vote for one when she has the opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Musicians' Union state that most UK musicians rely on performing and touring in the EU in order to make a living. So a bad deal or a no-deal Brexit is going to jeopardise their careers. I've listened to what the Minister has had to say, but we're almost at Brexit date. What discussions has her department had with the Home Office about creating a musician's passport that is inexpensive, lasts for a minimum of 2 years, and would do away with the need for otherwise permits, permissions, etc., which is unsustainable for the music industry? Well said.
Minister.
I thank her for her question. I very much appreciate her concerns and the concerns of the industry, as I've already said. The Secretary of State, in fact, spoke to the Musicians' Union earlier this week. We're acutely mindful of the concerns of this, but I will yet again encourage Honourable Member the best way through this is to have a deal, and when there's the opportunity to vote for one, please may she do so.
Bob Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I refer to my entry in the Register of Interests. I agree with my honourable friend about the importance of a deal, but she will recognise that the concerns of the Incorporated Society musicians are legitimate and need to be addressed. Will she also speak to those who run our major opera companies? Britain is a world leader in this, and the ability to fly in replacements at the last minute, often in roles where very few people who could actually sing them, from often the EU, is very important in our international status in this art form.
I thank my honourable friend for his question. As he will know, I'm new to this post, but I very much look forward to talking to representatives from the opera sector and making sure that we continue to support this hugely successful part of our economy as we leave the European Union.
Order. Topical questions. Daniel Zeichner.
Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier on, my first oral question since I was appointed, I'm thrilled to be holding this role and working to make the country better connected and more creative. This week, the government announced £5 billion further to support the rollout of gigabit connectivity, delivering greater connectivity to those who need it. Honourable members will be aware of our ongoing work to keep people safe online and our proposals around age verification for online pornography. I'd like to notify the House that the standstill period under the EU's Technical Services and Regulations Directive expired at midnight last night. I understand the interest on all sides of the House in this issue, and I'll update the House on next steps in due course. And finally, I'm sure that the whole House will want to congratulate Dina Asher-Smith, who won the 200 metres gold at the World Athletics Champions. She is the first British woman to win a major global sprint title and the first Brit to win a World or Olympic sprint title since 1993.
Zeichner.
Mr. Speaker, the government's been taking out full-page newspaper adverts, including in the Cambridge News, to warn businesses of the issues ahead. And on data issues, they've been inviting businesses to take out standard contractual clauses. One business in my constituency tells me they will have to take out 72,000 such clauses. So can the Secretary of State tell us how many clauses will have to be negotiated for the entire economy and how many are actually in place?
Well, the honourable gentleman is right that if we are not able to reach a deal with the European Union, then one of the ways, or recommended way, to handle the transfers of personal data is to insert standard contractual clauses in relevant contracts, and the Information Commissioner's Office has got full details of that. We've tried to make that as easy as possible. Inevitably, many private businesses are, of course, reliant on or focusing on running their business, but I refer really to what my ministerial colleague said earlier on. If we want to avoid any of these problems, the best way is to have a deal and for the House to vote for that deal when hopefully it's presented to them.
Sir Henry Bellingham.
Mr. Speaker, can the Secretary of State confirm that the Prime Minister's very welcome announcement yesterday about broadband access and mobile phone connectivity really, I'd rather the Secretary of State answer it, actually, if he doesn't mind, really will have a transformational impact on rural areas like North West Norfolk? And can she also confirm that it is actually new money?
Can I thank my honourable friend, my right honourable friend, very much indeed. Yes, it is new money, but and it's also very much to make sure that our rural areas do not lose out in the search for greater connectivity. He will know from his constituency work just how important it is that businesses and households in his constituency are fully connected to the internet, and how important that is for driving up productivity in our economy.
Yeah, Smith.
Mr. Speaker, given that spending on youth work has fallen £880 million since 2010, I was very interested in the government's announcement this week, but note that it is just £50 million per year in revenue for the sector. Given that we've had at least 760 youth centres close their door and 14,500 youth and community workers lose their jobs since 2010, does the Secretary of State really think that the announcement of just 60 new youth centres really cuts it?
Yeah. Well, I do find it extraordinary that from the opposition front bench is not a welcome for £500 million for the Youth Investment Fund to be spent in a myriad of different ways, but a criticism. Actually, the sector has shown itself to be very strong and resilient, and of course it's absolutely typical of the Labour Party to focus on buildings and facilities, not what's going on and not the support offered to young people.
Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Further to that answer from my right honourable friend, the £500 million Youth Investment Fund is warmly welcomed across the country. What steps is she going to take to ensure that young people can participate in sport, drama and music as a result of this fund?
Well, can I thank my old friend very much indeed for that question. He's absolutely right. I can give him that reassurance. I think those activities, the access to art, drama, sport and other creative and cultural activities is an absolute right and entitlement for young people. I'm delighted and excited to find that this is a department that is responsible for youth policy out of school hours, and I hope that he will encourage organisations in his constituency to put in bids for this funding when details are announced.
David Hanson.
On the question of online abuse, what steps are the government taking with regard to those anonymous accounts that pour bile out and hide behind anonymous accounts so that they can be held to account for their comments?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As part of our online harms work, we will of course look at what benefits and costs come with anonymity online. We are very conscious that for the purposes of whistleblowing, for instance, then anonymity can be an important part, but we all know how people hide behind anonymity as keyboard warriors.
Stephen Kerr.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Stirling constituency is the third worst constituency for mobile phone coverage in Scotland. Can I ask what the government is doing to remedy this?
As the honourable gentleman knows, we have recently announced £5 billion that will cover connectivity in all its forms, and that, of course, includes Scotland. It's probably worth saying I recently met with Paul Wheelhouse, my opposite number, in the Scottish Government. We got on well. We will work well together. It's a good job we got on well, because under the SNP, broadband needs all the help it can get.
Gareth Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Major national cultural institutions like the Tate should put their brands as well as the art in their collections behind efforts to support regional and local art galleries and museums. Would the Secretary of State therefore in particular encourage the Tate to support proposals for pop-up Tate galleries at art galleries such as Harrow Art Centre, which serves my constituents?
I thank the honourable member for his question. It's an excellent proposal. I've already visited the Tate since I became a minister, and I'm well aware of a huge amount of work that they and other museums and galleries do, making sure that their collections are available around the country and that they are supporting other parts of the country as well as London.
Jack Lepresti.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A number of my constituents are stuck with a single broadband provider, which is in a monopoly position, so charging very high prices for very poor service. So what can the government do? What steps are you taking to try and ensure greater competition, which will drive down prices and improve the service?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're acutely conscious that the best possible market is going to be a market that is driven by competition. As we take forward the huge investment to cover a better connected country, then one of our key aspirations will be in the long term to develop that greater level of competition.
Stuart C. MacDonald.
Mr. Speaker, we've been waiting since July for the government to raise the charity lottery annual sales limit to £50 million, and every month of dither and delay means good causes across the UK are missing out. When will we see this widely supported and carefully consulted on policy finally delivered upon?
So as he knows, the government ran a consultation from June to September 2018, reviewed these 1,600 responses, concluded that the per-draw limit for society lotteries would increase from 4 million to 5 million, and the prize limit from 400,000 to 500,000. The government is committed to make sure that the regulatory framework for lotteries is appropriate and that both society lotteries and the National Lottery are able to thrive. The Gambling Commission is going to run a consultation, however, seeking views on additional transparency measures before the new limits are implemented.
Robert Courts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's been another brilliant year for national citizen service schemes in Witney. Young people in learning vital life skills and having great fun at the same time. Would the Minister please confirm that this scheme continues to have and will continue to have the government's full support?
Secretary of State.
Well, can I thank my friend very much indeed for that. I'm absolutely happy to provide that commitment. We think the National Citizen Service is a fantastic scheme. It's the fastest growing, I think, youth activity scheme in the country. And I know he's obviously enjoyed his visits. I've very much enjoyed my visits to NCS in Loughborough.
Thank you. Mr Speaker, yesterday the Premier League announced a new chief executive who will face the same old problems: lack of financial transparency, lack of fan engagement, disreputable ownership. Yes. The Secretary of State talked about the English Football League review, but she cannot leave our premier sporting and economic asset in the vested interests of self-regulation. So will she urgently meet with fans to ensure that whatever the results on the pitch, and as a Newcastle United fan, I know that can be up and down, whatever those results off the pitch, fans are the winners when it comes to financial regulation of football.
Yeah. Can I thank the Honourable Lady very much indeed. She's absolutely right to say that it's quite an emotional experience, can be a bit of a roller coaster being a fan of a football club. I think we ought to see how the new appointment obviously decides to embrace the new appointment, but of course it'll either be me or the Minister for Sport, always very happy to meet with organisations.
And Damien Hines.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Gigabit fast would be fantastic, but just a bit fast would be great for many East Hampshire homes and businesses. What comfort can my honourable friend give, not just for the hardest 20% and 10%, but the hardest 5% and 3%?
My right honourable friend is absolutely right to raise this issue. This is something where we have to look first, in some ways, at the very hardest to reach areas, because we do, while commercial areas are important to upgrade to gigabit levels, it is where there is currently no broadband at all very often that we will make the greatest social and economic impact.
Jeff Smith.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Age UK have warned that the changes to eligibility for TV licences is likely to result in a big increase in fraudulent activity that targets vulnerable elderly people. Isn't that yet one more reason why the government should stop outsourcing its social policy and commit to keeping TV licences free for all over 75s?
Yeah. Well, thank the honourable gentleman very much indeed. The BBC has provided assurances that it will deliver the most sensitive possible handling for those obviously who are affected, and will work with older people's groups, charities and voluntary organisations to design a bespoke system to support all those over 75, including new easy payment plans and an information and advice programme. We want everyone who is eligible for pension credit to make sure that they are claiming it in order to get the benefit of the TV licensing.
Philip Hollowbone.
Declare my interest, Mr Speaker, as a member of Kettering Borough Council. Will the Secretary of State join me in congratulating Kettering Borough Council on its decision to match fund its successful £2 million bid for a heritage accent zone in Kettering Town Centre with a further £2 million? And does she agree that this £4 million proactive investment in the local high street must be good news for the local economy?
Well, can I thank my own friend? I am delighted to congratulate Kettering Borough Council for their match funding, and I think this just shows that actually where government investment is put in, actually then it will often unlock other funding, whether that's from the private sector or from local authorities or others, in order to make sure that our high streets are the thriving places we all want them to be.
Questions to the Attorney-General. Hang on, Debonair.
Keep going, Mr Speaker. I think you need a fisherman's friend, Mr Speaker. Question number 1, Mr Speaker.
The Attorney-General.
Mr Speaker, with your leave, I have the same cold. I cannot, I'm afraid, as the Honourable Lady will know, comment on the content of Cabinet discussions, but she will understand I regularly meet ministerial colleagues to discuss important issues of common interest, and it would be inappropriate for me to comment on the detail of those discussions, and I'm bound by the Law Officers' Convention that neither the fact nor content of the Law Officers' advice is disclosed outside of the government. But may I make it clear to the Honourable Lady, the government will obey the law, the Prime Minister is subject to the law, and this government will comply with it.
Hang on, Debonair.
So, notwithstanding all of that, I'm just going to ask the Attorney-General a nice yes-no question. The Act requires the Prime Minister to ask for an extension unless Parliament has agreed a withdrawal agreement or agreed to leave without one. So will the Attorney-General confirm that if Parliament has either not agreed to a withdrawal agreement or not agreed to leave without one, the Prime Minister would be acting unlawfully if he took us out of the EU, nevertheless, on the 31st of October? Yes or no, would it be unlawful?
What I can confirm to the Honourable Lady is that the government will obey the law.
Peter Bone.
Mr Speaker, if Parliament agrees a deal,
Does that satisfy what is known as the Benn Amendment?
The Attorney.
If Parliament agrees a deal, having had it brought before this House, then it fulfils one of the conditions that means that no extension has to be sought.
Very Chairman.
Mr. Speaker, can I ask the Attorney, if, hypothetically, if the government was seen to be breaking the law, who would arrest the Prime Minister? Would it be the Met, or who would arrest him?
Attorney.
I don't think really it's for me to comment on ridiculous speculations and hypotheticals of that kind. But I may say it's good to see the honourable gentleman looking calmer this morning.
Philip Oliver.
The Attorney General confirmed that the government can both comply with the law and leave the EU without a deal on the 31st of October.
The Attorney.
Yes.
So you can give him a yes or no answer.
Gavin Newlands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. When he was asked, the Attorney General said that his government would be adhering to the Benn Act. However, a day later, when asked by myself and others on this, the Prime Minister prevaricated until the end when he was asked by the Honourable Member for Edinburgh South if he would comply with the law. The Prime Minister's answer was a simple and quite astonishing no. So given his previous answer this morning as well, can you confirm for the House, was the Prime Minister wrong?
Well, I haven't seen the response the honourable gentleman refers to, but I can certainly confirm to him that the government will comply with the law, and I'm not convinced that the Prime Minister said anything contrary to that. I'd have to look at that, sir.
Nick Thomas-Symonds.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I have the European Union Withdrawal No. 2 Act in front of me, so perhaps the Attorney-General can confirm his interpretation of it. Because it's very clear that if this House hasn't approved a deal, or if it hasn't approved leaving with no deal, then the Prime Minister must seek to obtain from the European Council an extension in the term set out in the Act. Can the Attorney-General confirm that that is what this Act of Parliament requires?
Well, the honourable gentleman has read it out. He doesn't need any confirmation from me. He's a superbly competent lawyer. The government will, so I'm told, by others on his side of the House. The reality is the government will comply with the law.
Symonds.
I'm afraid it does require a confirmation from the Attorney-General. Let me just explain why. Because we keep being told the government will comply with the law, yet the Prime Minister goes around saying he'd rather be dead in a ditch than apply for the extension that he's required to under this Act. Now, does the Attorney-General not realise that the government's ambiguous position towards the rule of law is damaging our justice system, it's damaging our society, and it's damaging our international standing? Why does the Attorney-General just stand by and let this happen?
Attorney-General.
Because I am quite convinced and completely satisfied that this government will obey the law.
Rachel Maskell.
2, please, Mr. Speaker.
Number 2. Very well done. Attorney.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I'll take questions 2, 3 and 9 together, if I may. I cannot comment on the content of Cabinet discussions, but as I told the House last week, the judgment sets out the definitive and final legal position on the advice given to Her Majesty on the prorogation of Parliament. We are carefully and deliberatively considering the implications of that judgment. We need some time to do it, but a Queen's speech is necessary to bring forward a fresh legislative programme, and a short prorogation, as announced yesterday, is necessary, and we are advised to this effect by the parliamentary authorities for the Queen's speech.
Rachel Maskell.
In the light of the Supreme Court's judgment and the vital role that was identified of this House to scrutinise the executive, how is the Attorney-General discussing with Cabinet colleagues to ensure that we will have sufficient time to discuss the proposals which the Prime Minister is due to bring forward, and how much time will we actually have to debate them?
Well, I know that those matters are being actively considered now. I'm sure they will be considered in consultation and through the usual channels, but as much time as conceivably can be made available will be made available to debate those very important matters. The Prime Minister is making a statement later this morning, and the government is more than conscious, acutely conscious, of the need for all members of this House to scrutinise any deal that may be agreed.
Joe Stevens.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. 8 days ago, the Attorney-General told this House in response to a question from the Honourable Member for Edinburgh South West that he would consider disclosure of his legal advice on the unlawful prorogation of Parliament. Can he now confirm that he will do the right thing and release his advice before Parliament is prorogued next week?
I have been considering that question. I'm still considering it. I have not reached a conclusion, and when I have, I'll make sure the Honourable Lady is informed.
Ian C. Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If this Attorney-General does believe in the law, can he confirm that he has discussed with the Prime Minister and with the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster the electoral offences committed by Vote Leave?
May I tell the honourable gentleman that I do believe in the law, and I've spent 37 years of my life adhering to those professional values. As for the advice I may or may not have given to any member of the government, he will know I'm bound by the convention. I can't tell him whether I have or if I have. I understand the purport of the honourable gentleman's question. I don't criticise him for it in the least, but I regret I can't help him as to the content of any advice I've given.
Bob Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would I just urge the Attorney to reflect that departing from the norm that law officers' advice is not disclosed is something that should only be undertaken with great care because of the implications for all future law officers and all future advice to government. But is not the rub of this issue simply this, that as the President of the Supreme Court said, the circumstances that gave rise to this judgment were, as she described, a one-off. The Court was asked to rule on a novel point where up until then legal opinion had varied. It's made a ruling and the government accepts and will abide by the ruling as it should with any ruling of our independent courts.
Attorney General. I completely agree with both parts of my honourable friend's question. Plainly, in connection with the Law Officers Convention, it's not a question of personal ownership by any particular attorney. It's a long-standing convention that protects all governments in often extremely sensitive, complex and difficult subjects, sometimes affecting the most important interests of this country. And of course I agree with him that the Supreme Court's judgment must be respected. It's final and binding as a matter of law, but it is peculiar to its circumstances.
Alex Chalk.
Mr. Speaker, our courts are scrupulously impartial and independent, and in the aftermath of the Supreme Court judgment, there have been some unwise voices who've suggested that we ought to move to some sort of US-style process of appointment. Does the Attorney-General agree with me that that would be extremely unwise and Her Majesty's Government has no prospects to proceed down that route?
My honourable friend, as ever, from the background of practice in the law, feels, as I do, that these kinds of hearings, certainly US-style hearings, would be a regrettable step for us in our constitutional arrangements. The government has no current plans to do so, but it is fair to say that the implications of the judgment and the continuing development of our constitutional arrangements will no doubt receive properly the intense scrutiny of this House.
Tunde.
Number 4.
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Attorney.
The priorities of my office are set out in the published business plan for this year, but in relation to the UK's withdrawal, I beg your pardon, Mr. Speaker, I'm answering the wrong question. And I beg the honourable gentleman's
No one had noticed.
Nobody had noticed, probably, the answers being the same. I can only plead that I'm getting your cold and was up far too late this morning. I'm not going to comment in detail again, if I may say to the honourable gentleman, on the content of Cabinet discussions, but the Supreme Court judgment undoubtedly represents a significant development in our constitutional arrangements. As I said the other day, it's important to take stock of the implications of this judgment, not in the immediate aftermath of a ruling, but deliberately, carefully and thoughtfully. We should not jump to hasty conclusions, and the UK's exit from the EU will have profound ramifications for our constitutional arrangements. And I've said many times before that I think that does require a coherent, careful examination, possibly through some formal channel, of the means by which we are to be governed after we leave the European Union. I'm not enthusiastic about the prospect of parliamentary scrutiny of judicial appointments, and the government, as I said to an earlier question, has no current plans to introduce such appointments.
I'm glad that the attorney eventually reached the matter of judicial appointments. That was very reassuring, not least to the honourable gentleman, Mr. Martin Day.
Thank you. I'm very grateful for the answer, and I heard what he said and what he also said to the previous question. But I just wonder if you could give me if you could categorically rule out any changes that could result in a political appointment system, because I think that's a very important point.
The government has no such plans to introduce any such appointment system. The only thing I will say to the honourable gentleman is that this House must have the right to determine the constitutional arrangements of this country. And of course, parts of that will have to reflect upon the role of the Supreme Court and its constitutional functions. But I agree with him that a US-style appointment system would be a wholly retrograde step.
Sir David Liddington.
Mr. Speaker, having had responsibility for a time for judicial appointments, including for approving those of the current Lord Chief Justice and the current President of the Supreme Court, could I ask my right honourable learned friend to endorse the fact that the track record of the Judicial Appointments Commission is that they make their recommendations having looked at the available candidates with the utmost thoroughness, scruple and genuine independence, and that we as a House and as a country would cast aside that independence and instead make the appointment of judges the plaything of a temporary party majority in this House at our peril.
Well, if I may say to my right honourable friend, I certainly couldn't have put it better than that. I agree with every word that he says. I think that, as I've had cause to say in this House only recently, we have one of the finest judiciaries in the world. They are beacons throughout the world of impartiality and independence. And this House should do all it can to promote, protect and preserve those values of impartiality and independence, and I agree with my right honourable friend that a US-style process of appointment would not be in the interests of this country, and I don't think that I can improve upon the way my right honourable friend put it.
Michael Tomlinson.
Question number 5.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I'll take questions number 5 and 8 together. The unduly lenient scheme is an important avenue for victims, for family members and the general public to ensure justice is delivered in the most serious cases, and that's why the government has announced an extension of this scheme to cover further child sexual abuse offences, such as those involved in the taking and distributing and publishing of indecent images of children. In 2018, the law officers referred 1/5 of all eligible cases which were considered by my office to the Court of Appeal, and of those, 73% were found to be unduly lenient.
Michael Tomlinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the Solicitor General for his answer. Can he set out how the new announcement on unduly lenient sentences will help victims of stalking?
Minister.
Yes, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for that question. The unduly lenient scheme is an extremely effective scheme. It's now been in existence for some 30 years. It applies to a myriad of offences, but we wanted to extend the scheme to include a range of 14 offences of a sexual nature, including of child abuse and indecent images. The scheme now includes those and will do so in future, and a range of others are clearly available for consideration under the unduly lenient scheme, which will serve to ameliorate the situation as far as the previous gaps were concerned.
Bob Blackmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Solicitor General for his answer thus far. What action is he taking to alert the victims of crimes on steps they should take to actually bring the scheme into operation, and also the wider public, so the public will understand that actually unduly lenient sentences should be a thing of the past?
Minister.
Yes, we're very fortunate in this country to have a judiciary who get it right, frankly, almost 100% of the time. We have some 80,000 sentences that have passed last year, for example, and of those, only about 100 had to be referenced to the Court of Appeal and were found to have been unduly lenient. So they are very few and far between, but he's quite right that victims ought to be aware of those the available options for when a sentence has been unduly lenient, and the Crown Prosecution Service are doing everything they can to make sure victims are so informed.
And any on?
Number 6, please.
Minister Ellis.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. If I may, I'll answer this question with 7 and 10. I engage with the Director of Public Prosecutions regularly on criminal justice issues, including rape and serious sexual offences. Both the Director and I recognise the devastating impact that these horrific crimes have on victims. I met with the Director of Public Prosecutions only a week or two ago, and again this week. Indeed, the Crown Prosecution Service and my office have worked closely with criminal justice partners in the ongoing government review into the response to rape and serious sexual offences.
On.
So, what reason did the Director of Public Prosecutions give for the dreadful drop in CPS prosecutions by 51% in these cases since 2014?
Minister.
Well, I am disappointed in the figures that she has referred to, and I appreciate that they are a cause for concern. However, I would emphasise, Mr. Speaker, it is not indicative of a lack of commitment to prosecute by the Crown Prosecution Service, and certainly by any of its prosecutors or by the Director of Public Prosecutions. There are a number of factors which we believe have contributed to this. That includes perhaps a fall in the volume of referrals from the police and an increase in the volume of digital data. But we're looking at it very closely, and a review is underway.
Kerry McCarthy.
Mr. Speaker, there have been reports that the number of reported rape, sexual assaults and harassment allegations in universities have tripled in the last 3 years. And there's quite worrying reports that universities are trying to carry out their own investigations of these sorts. What role does the Minister feel that his department can play in trying to ensure that these allegations are taken seriously and go through the proper judicial channels?
Well, I also have heard about those increased statistics from universities, and I would urge universities to look very carefully at how they are handling these matters, and it is a particularly sensitive issue which they should handle with professional assistance. But the reality is that we must do everything we can to deal with these allegations immediately and sympathetically and appropriately in all the circumstances. These are devastating allegations, and they must be dealt with sympathetically and appropriately by universities and by everyone else.
Ruth Jones.
Mr. Speaker, I'm alarmed to hear that police forces across the country are demanding highly personal records and data, including health, school and college records, and even counselling notes from potential rape victims before pressing ahead with their cases. Campaigners have long warned that victims will be put off going to the police by this intrusion into their lives. Can the Attorney-General outline what he's doing to combat this?
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for that question, and we want victims to have the confidence to come forward, to report crimes, and I don't want to see anything that disincentivises victims from making proper reports of crimes. And the Police and Crown Prosecution Service are continuing to work with victims groups who specialise in this area, and the Information Commissioner's Office when it comes to digital disclosure, to ensure that their approach offers the necessary balance, because of course there is a balance to be drawn between the requirement of reasonable lines of inquiry and the victim's privacy.
Ardell.
Number 11, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the priorities of my office are set out in the published business plan for this year. The UK's withdrawal from the European Union exercises the interest of my office in supporting the successful delivery of the government's objectives. We give legal and constitutional advice within the government and throughout the departments. And of course I'm engaged in supporting preparations for future international cooperation between law officers' departments with the prosecution and other criminal justice organisations.
Hannah Bardell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. But it would be good to hear the Attorney-General recognise the damage that a no-deal Brexit would create and the severe disruption that we know it would create across all government departments, instead of the language that we heard from him last week in Parliament, when he said that this was a dead Parliament and that MPs had no moral right to be here. Will he apologise for those comments?
Certainly not. I stand by every one of them. When this Parliament assumes its responsibilities to pass a withdrawal agreement, then I might reconsider them, but certainly not at the moment. I say to the honourable lady, we may soon have a chance to assume those responsibilities if we can get a deal, from the European Union. I hope then to see her vote for it.
However, we'll stand up for Parliament at all times. This Parliament, I completely respect the right of the Attorney to his view. This Parliament is entirely legitimate, it's doing its work, it should be expected to do so, and no amount of cheap abuse, calumny and vituperation directed at this Parliament will stop it doing its job. That's the way it is, that's the way it will continue to be, that's the way it has to be. Ms. Bryant.
Can I just ask about extradition? Because obviously we rely on, in this country, being able to extradite people from other countries in Europe to face justice in this country, and we've relied on the European arrest warrant. But as I understand it, if there's no deal, 4 or 5 countries in the European Union have now stated categorically that they will not extradite to the UK. How are we going to make sure that we get people to face justice in this country?
The honourable gentleman is quite right. There are some countries that will not extradite their own citizens. In those cases, it's a question of bilateral discussion with them. There is the existing Extradition Act, but if they won't extradite citizens, then of course there is the option of trying them in that country. That is generally the option that those countries offer in connection with their own citizens. Exactly, and it presents considerable difficulty, as the honourable gentleman points out. But we will be having bilateral discussions with those countries, seeking to agree specific arrangements with them.
This question, Valerie Vaz.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Leader of the House please give us the forthcoming business?
Leader of the House, Mr. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I do have a supply of throat sweets, should you need them. But I admire your stoicism in doing this. The business for next week will include Monday, the 7th of October, debate on a motion relating to the appointment of a lay member to the Speaker's Committee on the Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority, followed by a motion to approve a statutory instrument relating to the draft Northern Ireland Ministerial Appointments Functions No. 2 Regulations 2019, followed by proceedings in committee and remaining stages of the Census, Return Particulars and Removal of Penalties Bill, Lords. Tuesday, the 8th of October, motion to approve a statutory instrument relating to the draft Plant Health Amendment, etc., EU Regulations 2019, followed by motion to approve a statutory instrument relating to the draft Environment and Wildlife Legislative Functions, EU Exit Amendment Regulations 2019, followed by a debate in government time on baby loss awareness, and that may then be followed by all the necessary arrangements relating to the prorogation of the House.
Valerie Vaz.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I just acknowledge that the member for Perth and North Perthshire cannot be with us today. Can I thank the Leader of the House for the business and for ensuring that the government complies with the judgment of the Supreme Court, because now prorogation is just 5 days. He could have saved all that trouble, but at least now we have a definitive judgment about the capital A advice that the government gives to Her Majesty using prerogative powers, and they were found to be capital U unlawful. The opposition were asking for Parliament to be prorogued, Mr. Speaker, on Wednesday, so that the Prime Minister could come to the House and account for himself to the House at Parliament at Prime Minister's question time. But no show. He's like McCavity, the mystery cat. He's called the hidden paw. It's National Poetry Day, Mr. Speaker, or maybe in the Prime Minister's case, not so hidden pause. But the Prime Minister, as the Chief Whip, our Chief Whip has reminded us, has only done 1 out of a possible 4 Prime Minister's question time. So, no trade bill, no fisheries bill, no agriculture bill, no immigration and social security bill, financial services bill, all lost. The government simply don't want to do their job and bring their bills back. It's no wonder, Mr. Speaker, that the opposition parties have to seize the order paper. We need to use humble addresses to get the basic documents, the impact assessments. Could I ask the Leader of the House if, as the business is so paucity for next week, could we have our opposition day? The last one was on the 12th of June. Now, Mr. Speaker, the EU Withdrawal Act number 2 states at section 1, subsection 4, that the Prime Minister must write and deliver a letter requesting an extension to the President of the European Council. He will know, I'm sure, the Leader of the House, from having read the judgment, that Lord Diplock said this about the government. The government are accountable to Parliament for what they do so far as regards efficiency and policy, and of that, Parliament is the only judge. The government, are responsible to a court of justice for the lawfulness of what they do, and of that, the court is the only judge. So will the Leader confirm that the Prime Minister will comply with the law and that the law officers have warned him of the consequences if he failed to comply with the law? Mr. Speaker, turning to other breaches, the ministerial code. The Leader of the House will know how important it is that the ministers stick to the ministerial code. They must avoid real or apparent conflicts of interest. My honourable friend, the member for Plymouth, Sutton and Devonport, has asked me to remind the Leader of the House that it's possible that the Veterans Minister may or may not have broken the ministerial code when he hadn't resigned from his job as paid job from a veterans company when he became Veterans Minister. And the honourable member for Bishop Auckland raised a point of order on Monday on a possible conflict of interest. The Leader of the House will also be aware that Crispin Odey, a donor to various parties and people, made £220 million overnight as sterling slumped after the 2016 referendum result. Now, given the government have taken our policy on having 20,000 more police officers and raising the real living wage to £10, will they now support the Shadow Chancellor when he calls for an inquiry into the finance sector, including the regulation of hedge funds? And I hope now, Mr. Speaker, that the Leader of the House will apologise to you for what he said in his speech at conference when he accused you of damaging the standing of the House in the eyes of the British public to its lowest point in modern history. Now, the Leader of the House should get out more, because if he spoke to people outside, there are people cheering out there for how you've made Parliament more relevant. This from the person who slandered a good doctor and then had to apologise, slouched on the benches because he felt entitled to, then he had to apologise. And, Mr. Speaker, funnily enough, we thought he was one of your favourites, because when he was sitting over there, you always called him before all of us. The Leader has not updated the House on the British hostages held in Iran. These are British citizens used as bargaining chips. Nazanin's health and mental health is deteriorating, as she must consider being separated from Gabriella, as Gabriella may return to school in England. This is cruelty. Could we have a statement next week on what is the government's policy towards protecting state-held hostages? Warm words are not enough. It's time to act. And, Mr. Speaker, it is Black History Month. I want to pay tribute to the Right Honourable Home Secretary for her excellent outing at the dispatch box, making history as the first black woman at PMQs. And, of course, Dina, yes, shut over now. And, of course, Dina Asher-Smith. And she made, the Right Honourable Member made women at the heart of her questions. So I too want to pay tribute to the Honourable Member for Dewsbury, the Honourable Member for Walthamstow, and of course the Honourable Member for Canterbury for their bravery. Black History Month reminds us of their contribution and the contribution our parents made. Our parents had to face terrible racism when they first came here. Racism is pernicious, whether blatant or unconscious. And finally, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank you and your office and all the House staff for ensuring that we returned after the unlawful proroguement, so that right honourable and honourable members could rightfully take their place here in the House.
Leader of the House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I won't take those in order because I think it would be sensible for me to clarify what I said about you, because I don't think I've said anything publicly that I haven't said to you before, that I have been one of your great admirers in some of the things that you have done in helping this House hold the government to account, and that is absolutely right and proper. But I disagree, as you know, with some of the decisions made over the last year. What I actually said in my speech at the Tory Party conference, that your speakership should be taken in the round, with the bits that I think have been tremendously important, with the bits that I think have not been as I would have wished them. And that is my position, and I think it is respectful to the office of Speaker, and if I may say so, not unfriendly to you personally, and I hope and trust you will take it in that spirit. The Right Honourable Lady had the audacity to say that my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, wasn't appearing in front of this House often enough, that he was McCavity. Well, it's a rather odd version of McCavity. My right honourable friend, in the 10 sitting days since he's been Prime Minister, has spent 494 minutes in front of this House. He has been running at an equivalent rate of 49 minutes today. He will be ready to speak to this House after this session has finished. He is speaking at an incredibly dutiful and proper rate and can be held to account because in statements, Mr. Speaker, you allow considerable latitude, and if I may say rightly, to the questions that are asked. So instead of doing a brief Prime Minister's question session, he's done 494 minutes. I don't think anyone can complain about that. As regards the opposition day and the order paper, I think these two come together. The opposition, if it wants control of the order paper, can have an opposition day. It can have it on Monday or on Tuesday for a no-confidence vote. And if it has any confidence in itself, it will do that. Though I was in a toy shop recently with my children who thought that they deserved some toys, and there was a plastic chicken plucked with no hairs or feathers on it, and if you squeezed it, it made a squawk. I cannot think why, Mr. Speaker, but it reminded me of Her Majesty's opposition. Now, the Right Honourable Lady also said that the government is accountable to Parliament and that Parliament is allowed to pass its laws, and of course the government is accountable to the court. But, Mr. Speaker, we all serve one higher authority. The courts, Parliament and Her Majesty's government are all accountable to the British people, and 17.4 million people voted to leave. And whatever laws we passed and whatever court judgments come through, we must remember that it is the people who have the ultimate say, and that is the foundation of our democracy. The Right Honourable Lady then made some points about conflicts of interest. Of course it's appropriate that the ministerial code is followed, and it will be. I would say moving from the private sector into the public sector fully is not an always simple thing to do. One sometimes has so many commitments that it's hard to remember all of them. But she then went on to criticise Crispin Odey for making money out of sterling falling. May I remind her that one of the major funders, allegedly, of the Remain campaign, the sort of Ramona funder-in-chief, is one George Soros, who made £1 billion when sterling crashed out of the exchange rate mechanism, which is 5 times as much as Mr. Odey has said made. So I fear all she is saying is that Mr. Soros is a better hedge fund manager than my friend Crispin Odey, who is a great friend of mine and indeed a supporter of mine. The Right Honourable Lady then made a point about the Shadow Chancellor and whether I've listened to him. I might listen to him when he apologises to my friend, the Right Honourable Member for Tatton, for things that he said about people being lynched. Until he does that, I think he should sit in shame, not on that bench, but on the steps of your chair, Mr. Speaker, because it is really so shocking that members of this House should call for other members of the House to be lynched, and something I think we should all criticise, and I'm sure that honourable and right honourable members opposite feel that as well. The Right Honourable Lady mentioned, as always, and quite rightly, Mrs Nagari-Radcliffe, and as she knows, as I said last week, both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary have been in touch with the President and the Foreign Secretary of Iran, respectively, and that is quite right, and this issue must be pushed continually. I wish it were in the gift of Her Majesty's Government to achieve the liberty of all the people who are held illegally, unjustly, improperly by foreign states, but we must push wherever we can. And may I add to the congratulations for the Right Honourable Lady, the Shadow Home Secretary, it is a sign of what a good society we are becoming, that we are now completely relaxed about what race people are when they appear at the dispatch box. And I hope that that will continue. And I absolutely endorse what the Right Honourable Lady said about racism being wrong. It's not only wrong, it is evil. And it is something that we should all wish to oppose and to root out. And it should be a sadness to all of us that the Labour Party is the second party after the BNP to be investigated by the Qualities and Human Rights Commission for its anti-Semitism. That should be not something we use as a party political point, but something that actually is bad news in terms of the body politic generally. And as we come to prorogation, I should very much like to thank all the House staff for the terrific work that they do. It is very impressive, and we rely on all of them and their commitment and their love of Parliament, which I think is something many of us share.
Sir David Amis.
Will my right honourable friend find time for a debate on the rights of British citizens held in prisons overseas? My constituent son, Mr Lakbir Sandhu, has been held in a Czech prison for 9 months without being charged. He has apparently been denied proper legal representation, and worse still, his family are finding great difficulty in obtaining visas to visit their son.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and this follows on very much from what the Right Honourable Lady, the Shadow Leader of the House, was saying. The rights of British nationals imprisoned abroad was the subject of a Westminster Hall debate in March 2018, and I echo the response of the then Minister for Asia and the Pacific when I reiterate that the Government is proud to uphold a long tradition of offering British nationals a comprehensive, responsive consular service. Consular officials in Prague have been providing assistance to Mr Sandhu since his arrest in January 2019 and have remained in regular contact with his family in the UK throughout. I'm unfortunately not able to go into the details of Mr Sandhu's case, but I understand that officials are responding to my honourable friend's specific questions, which he has also raised with Her Majesty's Ambassador in Prague. I would point my honourable friend in the direction of the Foreign Office's consular hotline to see what more support can be provided, and is worth reminding honourable and right honourable members that there is a hotline for members' use if there are consular problems. It's exclusively for members, but do be aware, Mr Speaker, that that is available, and if he would like to write to me, I will pass on his concerns to the appropriate minister.
Thank you. Patrick Grady.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I think it is disappointing that prorogation is going ahead before Prime Minister's questions next week. In fact, I was reflecting with my honourable friend from Livingston here that we think the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead, the former Prime Minister, has spent more time on the backbenches at PMQs since July than her successor has at the dispatch box, given his absence last week. And I don't think that's anything for the Government to be proud of. Of course, the biggest loser from prorogation is going to be my honourable friend for Perth and North Perthshire, who won't be able to present his Prime Ministerial appointment and Cabinet appointment a bill under the 10-minute rule next Wednesday. That will be a source of great disappointment to the House as a whole, to the Government in particular, I'm sure, and to my honourable friend. The only possible compensation of which, of course, will be to elevate him to the Privy Council, as he so richly deserves. We're also very disappointed at the lack of opposition days next week. We have made the requests through the usual channels, and as we've pointed out before, standing orders allocate days to the leader of the third party, which are not now going to be granted. And that must be getting very close to a contempt of the House, if it's not, at the very least, a gross discourtesy to the third party. So I do urge the leader to reconsider his allocation of time next week, important though the SIs that he's scheduled are. But perhaps we can end on a slight note of consensus. Last week he spoke about Padre Pio. On the 13th of October, the Christian community in this country will celebrate the canonisation of John Henry Newman. The all-party group in the Holy See will have a delegation representing the House in Rome. The Prince of Wales will represent the Queen. I wonder if anyone will represent Her Majesty's government. And next year will be the 10th anniversary of Pope Benedict's visit to the UK and his important speech in Westminster Hall. And I wonder if the leader would be willing to meet with those of us who have an interest in such things about how that can be appropriately commemorated in the Houses of Parliament.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. If I may, I'll answer the question in reverse order. The canonisation of Cardinal Newman is a matter of great joy to Catholics in this country and to other Christians, a matter of huge celebration. It is very, very rare that Britain is raised, elevated, becomes, by God's divine mercy, a saint, and we should all rejoice at that. And I don't know if a member of Her Majesty's government is going to be at the ceremony. I don't know whether the honourable gentleman was suggesting I go. If he is suggesting that, it's one that's very welcome, but it's not for me to decide. And I agree with him. It would be suitable to have a meeting to discuss the 10th anniversary of the Holy Father Emeritus's visit, which was a wonderful occasion and a very moving speech that he gave at that time. As regards opposition days, I'm going to say what I said to the Right Honourable Lady, the Shadow Leader. Should the honourable gentleman want to have a vote of no confidence, time will be made available and we will give them a day to speak, and which will give us the opportunity of speaking the other direction on the many virtues of this fantastic government.
I'm bound to observe that the leader's enthusiasm about canonisation is beginning to sound a little like ambition. Sir John Hayes.
I'm grateful, Mr. Speaker. Contrary to the claim of the Hollies, who are a well-known musical ensemble, the air that we breathe is not all that we need. But you can't live without it, as more than 10,000 sufferers from cystic fibrosis know as they gasp for breath each day. Yesterday in this House, the Honourable Member for Sheffield Brightside drew our attention to the drug Orkambi, which can be a life-saving treatment and certainly a life-changing one for more than half of those sufferers. Will the Leader of the House arrange for a statement to be made to say how that drug can be made available in the United Kingdom as it has been in Scotland? For, as Edmund Burke said, and I know you admire him as much as I do, Mr. Speaker, there is one law for all. That is the law which governs, that is the law of our Creator, the law of humanity, justice and equity. In the name of those virtues, please make this drug available to those who suffer in silence.
Well, Mr. Speaker, you know that this is an issue where for other drugs I have raised questions, and so I would encourage my right honourable friend, as I'm sure you would, to use the facilities of this House to press the point. And Mr. Speaker, you kindly allowed me an adjournment debate on the issue of Batten disease, and that drug, the drug for Batten disease, has now been made available. So with Orkambi, this is being discussed in the usual way between NICE and NHS England to decide the fair price for medicines. Vertex is the drug company concerned, and I think it would be right to urge them to accept the price that is being offered. But I can reassure my right honourable friend that the Health Secretary is meeting Vertex again. This is really serious. It is being looked at. But I would also encourage him to keep pushing.
I hope he'll take the hint. I hope he'll take the hint. Adjournment debates, urgent questions, emergency debates. Burke would expect nothing less of the right honourable gentleman. I'm very glad. Very well done. I'm very glad to hear it indeed. Mr. Barry Sherman.
Speaker, I wonder if the Leader of the House would agree with me that one of the most innovative and successful innovations in recent times has been the creation of a Children's Commissioner, and particularly with Anne Longfield as a very brave champion for children. But would you agree with me that we should have an early debate on what she revealed only last week, that 20% of the children coming out of our schools have no qualifications at all. That wasn't mentioned very much at the Conservative Party conference. Isn't it about time we looked at it, debated in this House and did something about it?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And indeed, yes, I welcome the fact that we do have a Children's Commissioner and share the honourable gentleman's concern that 20% of children leave school with no qualification. It's why so many of the education reforms that have been going through, and the extra expenditure that will be going to the Department of Health ought to improve that. It is, of course, something that will be easy to raise during the Queen's Speech debate. So one of the advantages of having a Queen's Speech is that many issues of importance like that can be raised and can expect a ministerial response in the debate.
Mr. Philip Davis.
Mr. Speaker, the government led by my right honourable friend for Maidenhead was very supportive of a Shipley Eastern bypass and paid for a feasibility study with a specific intention to complete the bypass when the feasibility study had ended. So can my right honourable friend arrange for the Secretary of State for Transport to come and make a statement to the House on this subject so that he can hopefully restate this government's commitment to building a Shipley Eastern bypass?
Mr. Speaker, what a great place Shipley is. I had the huge joy of visiting Shipley to campaign for my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, to become leader of the Conservative Party earlier this year, and it is brilliantly represented by my honourable friend. I will pass on his message to my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Transport, because I'm sure we want to follow in the excellent footsteps of my right honourable friend, the member for Maidenhead, who I notice is sitting behind me, watching proceedings closely.
Mary Rimmer.
Speaker. Will the Leader of the House advise this Chamber when the Government intends to share with this House its black swan scenario for a no-deal Brexit? And secondly, has the business and health sectors been advised accordingly?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Government will produce information in the normal way to ensure that people are properly informed about what is going on. The thing to bear in mind is that enormous preparations are being made in the event that we leave with no deal, and that the problems therefore are being worked through and sorted out to minimise anything that could happen. And therefore I'm not sure producing a black swan document would be enormously valuable. But the good news is, if the Honourable Lady holds on a bit, there will be a statement from my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, about the prospects of a deal, which seem to be brightening by the minute.
Mary Robinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the 1st of August, whilst the focus of the media was on the dramatic events at Toddbrook Reservoir, dozens of residents and businesses in my constituency were flooded, enduring the heartbreak of seeing their livelihoods and possessions engulfed by 4 foot of flood waters as it surged into their homes. Flood projects across the country have benefited from the £62 million recently announced, but in the absence of any applicable project from Stockport Council, my residents won't benefit. Would the Leader of the House give Government time for a debate about the extension of flood resilience schemes and a requirement for councils and government to help vulnerable homes and businesses prepare for future flood events?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my honourable friend said, there was the £62 million funds, and the government is always there to help when acts of God or natural disasters hit, and the awfulness of having 4 feet of water flood a property is something it's very hard for individuals to bear, and they need support in these difficult circumstances. So the question of time for debate, I think we're quite limited on, but as I said before, it is something that could come up in the Queen's speech, and I will ensure her point is passed on.
Hilly Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recently met with Centrepoint, who do fantastic work on youth homelessness, which is sadly rising with an estimated 103,000 young people in the UK homeless or at risk. One of the main drivers is that under-25s receive less financial support for housing, which often doesn't cover local rents. So can we please have a debate in government time on the shared accommodation rate and tackling youth homelessness?
Hear, hear. Well said.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the things that was announced at the Conservative Party conference was that the minimum age rate will entry rate will come down, which will help younger people to earn more money. And that must be a good thing to ensure that they have the resources that they need, and also that we will be building more houses, because one of the problems is a shortage. And I think last year was the highest year, but all but one in the last 30 for house building. So we are moving in the right direction.
Sir Greg Knight.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can we have a debate about making better use of time? Is the Leader of the House aware that in 3 weeks we will go through that ridiculous ritual of putting our clocks back, thereby plunging the country into darkness and misery by mid-afternoon? So can we have a debate to look at the benefits of staying on summertime all year round?
Mr. Speaker, when we had this debate some years ago in this House, I proposed that we should restore the situation to before the railways came, and that Somerset should go back to its own unique time, because I think that Somerset deserves to be represented in a special way. Do you know, I find that one of the best days of the year is the day the clocks go back, because one gets an hour extra in bed, and I've always thought that is rather welcome.
Stephen Lloyd.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know whether the Leader of the House is aware, but a few days ago at Treasury Questions, a number of colleagues on both sides of the House pointed out to the front bench that there had been 7 suicides from people affected by the loan user charge. I would remind the Leader of the House that in July 2018, I urged the Treasury front bench install a mental health helpline at HMRC. My urging was rejected. Then I would urge the Leader of the House to go to his colleagues on the Treasury front bench and get that mental health helpline updated and put it at HMRC before there are any other unnecessary deaths.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable gentleman raises a point of the highest importance. Any government policy that is linked to suicide is something that rests on the government's conscience. And what he has suggested, I will certainly pass on to Her Majesty's Treasury.
Mr. Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member for Gateshead, the chair of the Backbench Business Committee, is detained on urgent constituency business. So on behalf of the Backbench Business Committee, I just want to draw the leader's attention to the fact that the Backbench Business Committee dissolves on prorogation, and therefore the chair and the members will have to be elected as soon after the state opening as is possible. So a number of quick pleas, if I may, Mr. Speaker. First, can we make sure that that election takes place quickly and expeditiously so the committee comes back into operation? Secondly, we will meet on Tuesday and produce a list of prioritised debates for backbench business time. So if the government is putting on general debates, we'll give the leader an opportunity to select many of those. And thirdly, could we now move away from this nonsense of the chairman and committee being disbanded at the end of the parliamentary session and being re-elected, so that we keep for all select committees the same process for the duration of Parliament? Finally, Mr. Speaker, on my own behalf, can I invite my right honourable friend to wish all those Hindus celebrating Navratri Jayambe.
Mr. Speaker, to the last point, yes, I'm very happy to do that. In response to the points throughout the Backbench Business Committee, yes, we will ensure that it is re-established quickly. Yes, it is extremely helpful and welcome that the Backbench Committee, before it dissolves, will propose a list of debates. And can I at this point thank the Backbench Business Committee, and particularly its chairman, for the terrific work they do. It is invaluable to Backbench members that they have this facility. It's also of immeasurable use to the Leader of the House, because I can often say this is a matter for the Backbench Business Committee, which is something of a stock answer, you may have begun to notice, and without it I might find question time rather harder. As regards changing to a longer period of appointment, the Backbench Business Committee does have unique powers which are unlike those of any other select committee, including a significant amount of time in the chamber. So although the government's very happy to think about this, and perhaps the Procedure Committee might want to think about it too, I'm not going to promise any rapid change.
Chris Brandt.
The Leader of the House mentioned IPSA, which is very tempting.
Go on.
But I'm not going to go down that route. I want to
Go
make
on,
him
Chris.
promise that just as the United States of America has now had 2 traumatic brain injury acts, which have made dramatic differences for many millions of people in the United States of America, whereas we have never yet had one, he will include it in the Queen's speech, because there's 1.4 million people in the UK who've suffered from acquired brain injury. They don't often get the rehabilitation they need, and we could give them a real quality of life if we took action across the whole of government.
Here, here.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable gentleman makes, as always, a very important and significant point. I cannot make promises as to what will be in the Queen's speech. It isn't entirely within my remit as Leader of the House to dictate what Her Majesty will say, but his point is a very important one. In terms of legislation, obviously once there's a new session, there will be the 13 days for private members' bills to come back, and it may be that this is something that has that level of consensus that it could be very suitable for a private member's bill.
Mr. Peter Bow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I wish you a speedy recovery. Can I ask the Leader of the House about in relation to next week's business? The Speaker is clearly suffering from his voice and a problem, and he does put enormous hours in the chair, and he stays there for quite extreme times and has to shout at times to keep the House in order. Would it be appropriate, or would the Leader recommend, and I don't know the propriety of this, whether the Speaker is asked not to chair those sort of debates, particularly, say, on the European Union, to protect his health?
The expression "dream on" springs to mind. The Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I think this is entirely a matter for you to decide which debates you chair and which debates you don't chair, though I would say that for the convenience of previous speakers in past times, before there were deputies, there was a curtain that could... Is that not true? It is reported in good history books, but clearly not ones as good as those written by the honourable gentleman.
Rachel Maskell.
Mr. Speaker, it is regret that we have learnt today that the High Court case for 3.8 million women in this country was lost. Therefore, can we have a statement from the Minister to set out how this government is going to address inequality of women in later life?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm afraid, unlike the Honourable Lady, I welcome the decision from the court today. And the government did commit £1.1 billion to support those affected, and no one will see their pension age changed by more than 18 months relative to the 1995 timetable. So it is an 18-month maximum change from 1995. And, crucially, the new state pension is more generous for many women. By 2030, over 3 million women will gain an average of £550 per year. So, actually, I think the policy is worthy of support.
Jeremy Lefroy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I invite my right honourable friend to celebrate the canonisation of Cardinal Newman by joining us at the Parliamentary Choir concerts of Dream of Gerontius in both Coventry Cathedral and Westminster Cathedral in the coming weeks. But could I also ask him to arrange time for a debate on the financing of new hospital buildings? I welcome the announcements this week, but of course they will be financed by Treasury at Treasury rates of something like 3%. The Royal Stoke Hospital is having to pay much more than that under a PFI, which has been going for some almost 30 years, and it's costing us well over the 3%, something like £15 million a year. Could we have a debate on that? Let's have equality of funding for new build and restored hospitals.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful to the invitation to, I hope, hear the parliamentary choir rather than join the parliamentary choir. I think they would chuck me out pretty quickly if I started warbling. As regards PFI, my honourable friend makes such an important point that as a matter of ordinary routine, the government is always the least expensive borrower. And that was a fundamental flaw in many PFI schemes, hence the 6% rate paid by the Royal Stoke Hospital. Possibly we could broaden the debate out into the general failures of the previous Labour government to understand basic economics, because that's where I think the problem comes from.
Brendan O'Hara.
Mr. Speaker, overnight the US government slapped a whopping 25% tariff on Scotch whisky imports to the USA. As we both know, Mr. Speaker, my Argyll and Bute constituency produces some of the best whiskies we have ever tasted. But these tariffs, they affect jobs, investment and growth. So could we have an urgent statement and debate in government time to highlight the massive importance of the Scotch whisky industry to the UK economy, and what steps will this government take to tackle and to protect this vital industry?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was hoping the honourable gentleman was going to offer a tasting for honourable and right honourable members, perhaps in celebration of the Queen's speech. And many people think that whisky is very good for sore throats, so it may be that a bottle ought to be winging its way to the Speaker's apartments. The great advantage of leaving the European Union is that once we're outside the European Union, we won't be punished for the failures of the European Union, and this has been done because of a WTO judgment. The WTO has ruled against the European Union giving subsidies to Airbus. If we weren't part of the European Union, we can have separate agreements with the United States and no extra duty on Scotch whisky, which would be very good.
Robert Courts. Mr. Courts.
Mr. Speaker, Royal Air Force Bryce Norton are to be thanked and congratulated for having created a STEM inspiration programme with Carterton Community College that was mentioned in the Chief of the Air Staff's report to Her Majesty the Queen. The school has now taken that on and has created a group that is working with local businesses to further that inspiration as a sign of a very exciting new era for the college. But could we have a debate in government time so that we can, as a house, spread good practice examples and discuss how we further can create links between local organisations and businesses and schools that will create programmes that not only create the high-tech skills that businesses need, but the programmes that pupils will also benefit from?
Leader. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend makes a very good point and is quite right to advertise the great work done by the RAF at Bryce Norton, which I believe is in his constituency and therefore is virtuous simply by that fact. But it is certainly true that the government, business and schools should work together to ensure that technology can be improved. And there is wonderful technology in the military which can be built on for civilian purposes. So I encourage what he says.
Thank Debonair.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tempting as it is to ask the Leader of the House if he would just change the order paper for Tuesday and put the Agriculture Bill or the Fisheries Bill or any of these other missing bills back into this House. I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to ask him, nicely, if he would consider supporting my plea to whoever it is we plea to, that in the Queen's speech there could be included a commitment to a travel fund for the families of children with cancer and related diseases. It's a small number of children, thankfully, but it is often a huge burden and it would make such a difference to those children's and their families' lives.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, may I say that my near neighbour always asks for things nicely and with considerable courtesy, both in this House and when we have debated in other forums. I wonder if I might refer her to the Honourable Lady for Swansea, who I see is in her place, who campaigned very effectively for a fund to help parents whose children died to have the costs of the funerals borne by the government, which was a most wonderful campaign and proved to be effective. And it does show what backbench opposition MPs can do when they have the mood of the country behind them.
Andrew Jones.
Speaker, one of the harder issues raised with me at constituency surgeries is economic crime. This affects both businesses and individuals, both falling victim to fraud. Older people, I think, can be particularly vulnerable, and it's often hard to get full recovery of funds. I recognise this is cross-government work. It involves the police, financial education, the Crown Prosecution Service. But could we have a debate, please, to explore this issue and see what the government is doing to tackle this serious crime?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And May I say that if I were a constituent, I would find going to visit my honourable friend, the member for Harrogate, would be extremely reassuring, and it is hard to think of anybody who could be a better advocate for his constituents in his very beautiful constituency. Economic crime is a terrible scourge, and it is amazing the extent to which it is replacing other forms of crime as criminals realise how lucrative it can be. It does, of course, require a comprehensive response from the government in different departments and from the police as well. And it was worrying reports in the Times recently that said that some areas of the police were not taking this as seriously as they should. And I hope those revelations have encouraged the police to take these crimes more seriously.
Carolyn Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And thank you to the Leader of the House, I think. In September 2005, 17-year-old Ben Bellamy, the son of one of my constituents, was brutally murdered in Swansea. One of his killers has recently been recommended by a parole board to be moved to an open prison ahead of an early release. Ben's family are understandably upset about this, and particularly about the lack of communication from the probation service. Can we have a statement about this lack of communication and what interventions can be put in place to prevent other grieving families facing similar situations?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I did actually speak to the Lord Chancellor about this earlier on today and have an answer that, if I may, I will read out because I hope it provides the equivalent of a statement. The murder of Ben Bellamy in September 2005 was obviously a terrible crime for which Joshua Thomas and Joel Taylor are rightly serving the juvenile equivalent of life sentences. Ben's family are receiving the services provided under the Probation Victim Contact Scheme, as by the law they are entitled to receive. The Probation Service has apologised, and let me reiterate that the Probation Service has apologised for not notifying the family in 2017 in time that the High Court was hearing Joshua Thomas's application for a reduction in his minimum term of imprisonment. The family's victim liaison officer is committed to ensuring that the family are notified well in advance in time to exercise their rights in relation to both prisoners' future parole reviews. So I thank the Honourable Lady for bringing this to the attention of the House. I believe the Lord Chancellor has taken this very seriously, and the Probation Department has taken this seriously, and that this must not and should not happen again.
Ian C. Lucas.
Mr. Speaker, could we have an urgent statement from the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster concerning his ministerial responsibilities? He is denying responsibility for data protection and for electoral reform, which are clearly within his department. And again this morning we had a minister confirm, a minister from this government confirmed that he thought that he was responsible for these issues. If he is responsible for these issues, then I consider that he has obligations under the Ministerial Code, which I've conveyed to the Department. This is a very serious matter, going to the heart of integrity in government, and I would like, for once, a straight answer.
Mr. Speaker, all answers are straight answers. They're sometimes simply not the answers people want. These are two very separate concepts. The Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster has his specific responsibilities, and periodically the government produces a list of ministerial responsibilities. That has been asked for by my office on behalf of the House of Commons, and we will ask for it again, and we will release it to the House when that is available.
Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In August 2018, the Supreme Court ruled that parents who are not married should be eligible for widowed parents' allowance. But the UK Government has failed to pay this allowance to parents affected, and this is despite the fact that the Supreme Court ruled that failure to do so is both discriminatory and incompatible with the European Convention on Human Rights. 14 months after this ruling, I ask again, when will this government finally do the right thing and obey this ruling?
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for that question. That, as she knows, there is a simplified procedure for amending laws that are found to be incompatible by the Supreme Court with the European Convention on Human Rights, and that is working its way through the system, though I do accept that though the wheels grind fine, they sometimes appear to grind a little bit slow.
Joe Platt.
Speaker, following the devastating impact of austerity, my constituency of Lee has been starved of the investment we need to unlock the potential of our towns. We're without any rail connectivity, and we now find ourselves at the bottom of social mobility rankings. But incredibly, this government has chosen not to award us any Stronger Towns funding or future High Streets funding. Can we therefore have a debate on the allocation of this crucial funding to ensure that it's been fairly allocated based purely on need?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm glad to see that your voice is in good working order, unlike poor Mr. Speaker. The allocation of funding is always done properly. There are very tight regulations to ensure that this is done, so I can assure the Honourable Lady that everything was done with propriety, but I would encourage her to keep on arguing for facilities and funding for her town. That is what we are here to do as constituency MPs. We are here to argue the case for our areas, and I'm sure she will continue to do that.
Hugh Hendry.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I met with Citizens Advice in Macmillan, and they tell me that there are extreme difficulties for the terminally ill over explicit consent for accessing universal credit. They're being ignored by this government, and it prevents them from providing vital support. So can we have a debate in government time on why the DWP allows implicit consent for other services, but not for the dying on universal credit?
Look, Madam Deputy Speaker, the honourable gentleman makes a point that has to be looked into, that every possible facility should be given to those who are terminally ill, and every pathway should be cleared for them so that they can receive what they are entitled to. I will take this up with the DWP, and I will write to the honourable gentleman and see exactly what the situation is, and hope that if it is as he says, it will be improved.
Kate Green.
May we have a statement on progress in introducing the parking code? ESPL, which operates a car park in my constituency, is notorious for its punitive treatment of motorists, and its industry umbrella body, and the landowner seem powerless to do anything about it. Could the Leader of the House arrange for an urgent update on this matter?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think my right honourable friend, the member for Yorkshire East, who was here a moment ago, introduced a private member's bill on parking, and I have a feeling I put my name to it when I was still a backbench MP. So the honourable lady can understand that I share the concern that she has about this and about the way some of these companies behave. So what she is saying is unquestionably important. I can't promise her a debate, but she may want to raise it again, as I said, in other matters, in relation to other matters, in the Queen's speech.
Jim Cunningham.
Very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can we have a date as promised by the Speaker of the House to bring forward the proposals for private hire taxis and taxis in general terms? I'm told by the government that the legislation is available. We've been waiting for months now to get a date for that. Can we have a date and have a debate on it?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Because prorogation is now going to be on Tuesday, I can't promise any debates in this session of Parliament, but we will have a new session coming up. We will have obviously the Queen's speech, and we will have new business statements coming. So what the honourable gentleman has said has been heard and will be borne in mind both by me and no doubt by the Backbench Business Committee.
Cat Smith.
As the longest parliamentary session draws to a close, the government has had plenty of time to pass its bills through this place, and I'm reminded that on the 25th of July I asked the Leader of the House the whereabouts of the Fisheries Bill, and he reassured me. He said, all will be well. All is not well, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's the Fisheries Bill, the Agriculture Bill, the Immigration Bill, all these bills which will fall. So my question to the Leader of the House is this: how many bills will be falling next week?
Well, any bill that has not received royal assent by the time of the prorogation will fall. That is simple constitutional position. But what I would say to the honourable lady, it is the government's view that all primary legislation that is needed to leave the European Union on the 31st of October is on the statute book, unless we have to have a bill implementing a deal, which it now looks as if such a deal may be achieved, in which case I expect that may be mentioned in the Queen's speech without giving too much away.
Sweeney.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. 49% of Glaswegians own a car, so it means that the citizens of my constituency are disproportionately reliant on public transport, which is effectively in a monopoly control of a private company called First Group, which have been responsible for cutting hundreds of route miles across the city whilst hiking fares and benefiting from generous public subsidy. So would the Leader of the House consider calling a debate in the new Parliament, or indeed including it in his Queen's Speech provision, for a debate on the municipalisation of our public transport system, and particularly extending public control back over our municipal bus services, and indeed advancing Labour's proposals for a universal free bus service to ensure that people have a proper quality of life, they can access jobs and services that are otherwise denied to them because of punitive measures by a private profiteering bus company like First?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think we may be trespassing on devolved issues, so perhaps the honourable gentleman is calling for a wider debate on the competence of how the SNP run Scotland and how they ensure that public money is spent efficiently and effectively, because the British, the London, Westminster government is doing a great deal to improve public transport for buses and trains. £48 billion, I think, is going to be spent on the rail network, and more money for buses. So I think it's really a matter of devolution and the competence of the SNP.
Mr. Speaker, transitional arrangements for those in receipt of severe disability premium who are wrongly transferred from employment support allowance to universal credit has left them worse off. And this includes a number of my constituents who are very severely disabled. So can we have an urgent statement on Monday or Tuesday of next week before prorogation from the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions about what she is doing to resolve this terrible situation?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Lady raises an important point, and it's something that many of us in our constituency surgeries have seen, and I know that the DWP is working on it to ensure that it is put right. In the time available, I can't promise a statement.
Gareth Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Sunday, a vigil will take place outside Downing Street in memory of children who lost their lives or who disappeared at the end of the conflict in Sri Lanka in May 2009. Could we have a statement from the Foreign Office on whether they will ever apply serious pressure to the Sri Lankan government to allow an international investigation into the very serious allegations of war crimes and grotesque human rights abuses that have dogged Sri Lanka ever since the end of that conflict?
Mr. Speaker, I am in the happy position on this occasion of being the ventriloquist's dummy, because my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, was sitting next to me, and I was able to ask him briefly what his view is, and of course the Foreign Office will take this incredibly seriously and will look into it.
Mr. Matheson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We were told by every leading climate scientist in the world that we only had 12 years to act to stop climate change. Unfortunately, that was almost a year ago, and the clock is ticking. So would it be a good idea for the government to schedule in, perhaps at most quarterly, perhaps either a statement or a debate, so that this House can monitor and expedite progress towards achieving our aims of decarbonisation?
Well, again, I continue to be the ventriloquist's dummy, because the Secretary of State is sitting on my other side and has said we will be doing it much more frequently than that. So I'm pleased to bring good news to the House.
Gavin Newlands.
Mr. Speaker, my constituent is among the 2 million recipients of PIP whose case is scheduled to be reviewed as part of the LEAP exercise following the government's defeat in the courts on the treatment of people with mental health conditions. Without my office's intervention, his case would still be sitting in a huge pending pile, potentially for up to 2 years, with no information when his review would be carried out. So can we have a debate, or indeed action, in the Queen's Speech on the lack of resources made available to DWP to comply with the court's decision, and is this yet more evidence of the government's cavalier attitude to complying with court judgments?
Mr. Speaker, not at all. The government always complies with court rulings, and the DWP will do that as always.
You get paid.
Minister, it has been reported that Royal Mail is looking to recruit a director to run its UK operations. I would suggest the next director must stand with the postal workers to protect jobs, terms and conditions, and oppose the selling off of Parcel Force. Does the Leader of the House agree? And will he ask the Minister of the House to make a statement to this effect about selling off Parcel Force?
Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid I think that private companies must make their own decisions.
Rick Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A member of my team went to a chemist in my area this morning and saw a poster outside that said, "Please don't blame us for the NHS medicine shortages. It's a nationwide problem. Please ask our local MP to help." So there's clearly uncertainty and fear in the community, and so will the Leader of the House, as a champion of a no-deal Brexit, make clear that there will be no medicine shortages if we crash out of the EU? And if he can't confirm that, will he call a debate on this issue at the earliest opportunity?
Well, once again, I'm fortunate that the relevant Secretary of State is sitting to my side and reminds me we've had endless debates on this matter, and he very wisely put controls on 24 drugs which, in the ordinary course of events, were running into a shortage to make sure, particularly, I believe 19 of them are for HRT, were being in short supply, because the supply of drugs is always a complex issue, and fortunately the government has procedures in place in all circumstances to assure drugs are available, so I can give the Honourable Lady the reassurance she requires.
Alex Norris.
Mr. Speaker, in Bulwell, in my constituency, working with the Heritage Lottery Fund, we are developing a Pots, Pits and People project to celebrate our local heritage. A successful bid would really help us connect our community to our proud past. Might we have a debate in government time about the value of celebrating our local history?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman tempts me. I would be tempted to fill all the time of this House in debating history, not just local history, national history, the glories of our wonderful nation. We could spend hours on it, but I fear it may be more suitable in such a specific instance to ask for an adjournment debate.
MacDonald.
Mr. Speaker, as a consequence of new localness guidelines for commercial radio, hundreds of jobs have been lost, studios closed, and listeners are not getting the local news content that they want and that they need. Can we have a debate in government time about the importance of local commercial radio, including news coverage, and how best to allow it to thrive?
Mr. Speaker, I think the issue with things that are commercial is that they're commercial, and they will do well if what they provide commercially is successful.
Thank you. Statement. The Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I shall make a statement on the government's proposals for a new agreement with our European friends that would honour the result of the referendum and deliver Brexit on the 31st of October in an orderly way with a deal. This government's objective has always been to leave with a deal, and these constructive and reasonable proposals show our seriousness of purpose. They do not deliver everything we would have wished. They do represent a compromise, but to remain a prisoner of existing positions is to become a cause of deadlock rather than breakthrough. And so we have made a genuine attempt to bridge the chasm, to reconcile the apparently irreconcilable, and to go the extra mile as time runs short. Our starting point is that this House promised to respect the referendum before the vote. More people voted to leave than voted for any political party in our history, and this referendum must be respected. Both main parties promised at the 2017 election that they would respect the referendum and that there would be no second referendum. This House voted to trigger Article 50 and has voted repeatedly to leave. Yet it has also voted 3 times against the previous withdrawal agreement and for repeated delay. And so, as I've emphasised time and again, there can be no path to a deal except by reopening the withdrawal agreement and replacing the so-called backstop. While, as I stand here today, we are some way from a resolution, it is to the credit of our European friends that they have accepted the need to address these issues. And I welcome the constructive calls I've had over the last 24 hours, including with President Juncker, Chancellor Merkel and Taoiseach Varadkar. And the statement from President Juncker that the Commission will now examine the legal text objectively. The essence of our new proposal is a new protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland consisting of 5 elements. In the first place, all our actions are based on our shared determination to sustain the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, the fundamental basis of governance in Northern Ireland, the protection of which is the highest priority of all. And from this follows the second principle, namely that we shall of course uphold all the long-standing areas of cooperation between the UK and our friends in Ireland, including the rights of all those living in Northern Ireland and North-South cooperation, the common travel area, which predates both the Good Friday Agreement and the European Union itself. Third, we propose the potential creation of a regulatory zone on the island of Ireland covering all goods, including agri-food. For as long as it exists, this zone would eliminate all regulatory checks for trade in goods between Ireland and Northern Ireland. But fourth, unlike the so-called backstop, such a regulatory zone would be sustained with the consent of the people of Northern Ireland, as expressed through the Assembly and Executive. They will give their consent during the transition period as a condition for these arrangements entering into force. Thereafter, the Assembly will vote again every 4 years, and if consent were withheld, these arrangements would then lapse after 1 year. Fifth, it has always been a point of principle for this government that at the end of the transition period, the UK should leave the UK as the EU customs union whole and entire, restoring sovereign control over our trade policy and opening the way for free trade deals with our friends around the world. And that is a fundamental point for us, Mr. Speaker. So under the proposals in this new protocol, Northern Ireland will be fully part of the UK customs territory, not the EU customs union. But there will be no need for checks or any infrastructure at or near the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. Indeed, I have already given a guarantee that the UK government will never conduct checks at the border, and we believe that the EU should do the same. So there is absolute clarity on that point. Instead, under this new protocol, all customs checks between Northern Ireland and Ireland would take place either electronically or, in the small number of cases where physical checks would be necessary, they would happen at traders' premises or at other points in the supply chain. We have put forward a method for achieving this based on improving and simplifying existing rules, trusting certain traders, and strengthening our cooperation with Ireland in a spirit of friendship and sensitivity to the particular circumstances. So, while these proposals will mean changes from the situation that prevails today in Ireland and Northern Ireland, it is their driving purpose to minimise any disruption. And in order to support the transition further, we propose a new deal for Northern Ireland that will boost economic growth and competitiveness and set in train new infrastructure, particularly with a cross-border focus, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the previous withdrawal agreement and political declaration would have permanently anchored the UK within the orbit of EU regulation and customs arrangements, and an indefinite so-called backstop provided a bridge to that vision of the future. This government has a different vision, basing our future relationship with our European neighbours on a free trade agreement and allowing the UK to take back control of our trade policy and our regulations. And we propose to amend the political declaration to reflect this ambition. Our proposals should now provide the basis for rapid negotiations towards a solution in the short time that remains. I do not for one moment resile from the fact that we have shown great flexibility in the interests of reaching an accommodation with our European friends and achieving the resolution for which we all yearn. If our European neighbours choose not to show a corresponding willingness to reach a deal, then we shall have to leave on October the 31st without an agreement. And we are ready to do so. But that outcome would be a failure of statecraft for which all parties would be held responsible. When I think of the conflicts that have racked Europe in the past, of the immense challenges that we have together surmounted, of the 74 years of peace and prosperity that we have together achieved, I believe that surely we can summon the collective will to reach a new agreement. Mr. Speaker, this government has moved. Our proposals do represent a compromise, and I hope that the House can now come together in the national interest behind this new deal to open a new chapter of friendship with our European neighbours and move on to our domestic priorities, including education, infrastructure and our NHS. So, Mr. Speaker, let us seize this moment to honour our overriding promise to the British people: respect Brexit, get Brexit done, and I commend this statement to the House.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank the Prime Minister for an advanced copy of the statement. But what we have before us is a rehashed version of previously rejected proposals that put the Good Friday Agreement at risk, that would trigger a race to the bottom on rights and protections for workers, consumers and our precious environment. Given the seriousness of this issue and the vagueness of the proposals so far, can the Prime Minister tell this House if and when he plans to publish the full legal text that he must submit to the EU? These proposals would lead to an even worse deal than that agreed by the former Prime Minister. The Prime Minister signed up to the backstop in Cabinet and he voted for the withdrawal agreement as a backbencher. His letter to the President of the Commission yesterday claims both are now unacceptable. Perhaps he can tell us what has changed. Why did he support it then but oppose it now? The letter makes his intentions clear. It rejects any form of customs union, something demanded by every business and industry body in Britain and every trade union. They want to ditch EU standards on workers' rights, environmental regulations and consumer standards, and engage in a race to the bottom. Deal or no deal, Mr. Speaker, this government's agenda is clear. They want a Trump deal Brexit. A Trump deal Brexit that would crash our economy and rip away the standards that put a floor under people's rights at work, that protect our environment and protect our consumers. No Labour MP could support such a reckless deal that would be used as a springboard to attack rights and standards in this country. The truth is that after 3 years, this government still hasn't found an answer to solving the issue of the Irish border and the Good Friday Agreement. Where once the government was committed to having no border in Ireland, they're now proposing 2 borders in Ireland, ripping up the UK-EU joint report from December 2017. So can the Prime Minister confirm the government has now abandoned their commitment to the people of Northern Ireland, that they would ensure there is no physical infrastructure or related checks and controls on the island of Ireland? I'm sorry, I'm only quoting what the government said. Mr. Speaker, while EU leaders have been lukewarm, the response from businesses in Northern Ireland has been very stark. Glyn Robert, the head of Retail Northern Ireland, said the proposal would lead to north-south tariffs with, I quote, huge negative impacts on farmers and the agri-food sector. He went on to say, and I quote, it would also mean 2 borders requiring renewal after 4 years, surveillance in border communities without their consent, and checks north-south and west-east. Tina McKenzie, the chair of the Federation of Small Businesses for Northern Ireland, was absolutely clear. She said, all the promises of unfettered access have been abandoned. Northern Ireland is a small business economy, and this is the death knell for some of those businesses. Mr. Speaker, these plans are simply unworkable. Mr. Speaker, for what we have before us is not a serious proposal to break the deadlock. Instead, these proposals are nothing more than a cynical attempt by the Prime Minister to shift the blame for his failure to deliver. We can only conclude his political adviser was telling the truth when he called the negotiations with the EU a sham. So can the Prime Minister give a clear answer to one question? If he doesn't get a deal at the October Council Summit, will he abide by the law of this country, the EU Withdrawal No. 2 Act, and request an extension to avoid a disastrous no deal? Mr. Speaker, the government's proposals are neither serious nor credible. Labour consulted with UK industry, businesses and unions on the need for a comprehensive customs union, close single market alignment and robust protection for workers' rights and environmental standards. We need an extension for serious negotiations towards the sort of deal that Labour has set out. And then let the people decide, leave with a sensible deal or remain. The current proposals would damage the whole UK economy and the Northern Irish economy especially, and would undermine the Good Friday Agreement. They would lead to a race to the bottom on workers' rights, environmental rights, and strip back even the limited protections his predecessor had agreed to. Instead of spending the last few months building consensus in Parliament and across the EU, the Prime Minister has put forward proposals he knows won't be acceptable either in Brussels or Westminster, and that would damage the UK's industry, people's jobs and living standards. Mr. Speaker, the only people who won't suffer are the Prime Minister's hedge fund donors who are currently betting against the pound and running down our fragile economy. He is doing nothing but seeking to divide and risking this country's future for his own political gain. An America First deal with President Trump. The proposals are unrealistic and damaging and will, as I think the Prime Minister full well knows, be rejected in Brussels, rejected in this House and rejected across this country.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I must confess I am disappointed by some of the tone that and the remarks that the honourable gentleman has made, because I think that this is a very good basis for a deal, and to take his points in turn and to take his questions seriously, Mr. Speaker. He asks what is the advantage of this deal over the previous withdrawal agreement, and very simply it is this, Mr. Speaker, that the objections on all sides of the House to the previous withdrawal agreement were based on the backstop, which, as the right honourable gentleman knows, keeps the UK locked in the customs union and in the single market with no say on those arrangements. And, Mr. Speaker, I listened very carefully to honourable members on all sides of the House during those debates, and that was the burden of the House's objections to the backstop. He asks a reasonable question about standards, Mr. Speaker, environmental and social protections. And I think it would be the will of this House under any circumstances to keep our standards the highest in the world. The highest in the world. And the advantage that we have in coming out of the EU, as I'm sure the right honourable gentleman would accept if he reflected on it, is that we can go further. And there are some things that we can now do that have been long called for by the British people, for instance on animal welfare, that I think would be very advantageous. For instance, we can now ban the cruel export of live animals. And I'm sure that he will see that there are advantages that flow from this approach. He asked about physical infrastructure at the border, and I think I've been clear many times, and this government has been clear many times indeed. The previous administration, my right honourable friend, was absolutely clear that under no circumstances will the UK institute physical infrastructure at or near the border. he raised the concerns of businesses in Northern Ireland. And of course, they must be at the forefront of our minds. And we will ensure that their needs are properly looked after. And that is indeed why we have made the compromises that we have for the immediate future to protect their immediate interests. And they will, of course, he asked about unfettered access to the GB market. They will, of course, have unfettered access to the GB market. And that goes with that, and with no checks whatever. And one thing is absolutely certain about those businesses is that they want a deal, Mr. Speaker. They want a deal. I've talked to them, I'm sure the right honourable gentleman has. And I may say to him, and I say to the House, I believe this is our chance and their chance to get a deal. And I listened to what he had to say about delay and keeping this country in the EU beyond the 31st of October. And I must say, Mr. Speaker, that option does not commend itself to me. It would incur another £1 billion a month to no advantage whatever. I think the people of this country have had enough unnecessary dither and delay. They want to get Brexit done. They want to get on and do a deal. Mr. Speaker, this is a very good basis for the deal. I commend it to the House, and I hope that honourable and right honourable members across the House will support it.
Sir William Cash.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Welcoming indications of progress in these negotiations, will my right honourable friend agree that the overriding democratic issue is that the referendum result itself and the Withdrawal Act, with the 31st of October as the end date, confirms the sovereign and inalienable right of the British people to govern themselves, and that we need, in this country, a general election now and get Brexit done?
Prime Minister.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, but of course the opposition has many times, at least several times, rejected the invitation to have a general election for reasons that I think will be apparent to most people in this House and most people in this country. We must leave them to consider their own decision. But what I can certainly tell him is that under this deal, this country will certainly be taking back control not only of its borders and its money, but also, of course, of its laws.
Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Prime Minister for an advance sight of his statement. Mr. Speaker, I want to be very clear with the Prime Minister from the outset. These proposals are unacceptable, they are unworkable, they are undeliverable. It is all about blaming someone else, in this case the European Union, when his plan is rejected. Mr. Speaker, it is a plan designed to fail. But of course, the Prime Minister knows that. By his own design, this take-it-or-leave-it threat is yet another push towards a catastrophic no-deal exit. Mr. Speaker, for Scotland, these proposals would take us out of the European Union, the single market and the customs union against our will.
That's the deal.
The UK Government's document talks about the consent of the people of Northern Ireland as being required. Where is the requirement for the consent of the Scottish people who voted to remain, whose voices are ignored by this Conservative government? The Prime Minister may have bought the consent of the DUP with these proposals, but every other political party in Northern Ireland and every other major business group are not buying it. And, Mr. Speaker, they're not alone. The Prime Minister doesn't have the consent of this House. He doesn't have the consent of these islands for this doom deal or for a devastating no-deal Brexit. Let me tell him now, he will never have the consent of Scotland. Prime Minister, why is it acceptable for Northern Ireland to stay in the single market of the European Union, but not for Scotland? This is not a basis of a deal. It is a half-baked plan from Dominic Cummings and his Brexit fanatics. The Prime Minister knows that he can't get his proposal approved, and he doesn't care. Because the truth is, The Prime Minister either has no interest in getting a deal or doesn't grasp the reality of a workable backstop. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister must be reminded that he is duty-bound to obey the law and seek an extension to the 31st October deadline. So, let me put this to the Prime Minister. The proposed deal is dead even before it left the podium of the Tory conference. The Prime Minister's contempt for this House, because that's what it is, for democracy, for the people to have their say through their representatives, is clear for us all to see. This House must take back control, not for us, but for the people that we serve. So I want to ask the Prime Minister, and Mr. Speaker, if I may, I want the Prime Minister to think very carefully before he answers. And I say to him, give us an actual answer. Will the Prime Minister obey the law as required to seek an extension? And if not, will he commit today, right here, right now, that he will resign? Mr. Speaker, we will not let the Prime Minister shift the blame. You know, Mr. Speaker, it is quite remarkable, because we're talking about a Prime Minister threatening to break the law, and the guffaws from the Tory benches really says it all. Mr. Speaker, we will not let the Prime Minister shift the blame for his devastating plans for a no-deal Brexit. The responsibility for the catastrophic threat lies solely and squarely at the Prime Minister's door. That's why I want to put the Prime Minister on notice. The SNP will do everything possible to secure an extension and to stop a no-deal Brexit. So I say to the Prime Minister, be warned, secure an extension or resign. If not, the SNP stand ready to bring this government down.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I would just briefly, again, I must say I'm slightly disappointed by the tone the right honourable gentleman has taken. I would remind him that the people of Scotland voted to remain in the UK and in the UK single market. The best way, if he wishes to avoid a no-deal outcome, and I respectfully suggest to him the best way to avoid that would be to vote for a deal that we secure. And I think that these proposals do amount to a very good basis for a deal. And finally, thirdly and finally, Mr. Speaker, if he wants to remove me from office, then the best thing he can do is to work on the right honourable gentleman opposite and persuade him to call a general election and try his luck that way.
Damien Green.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of us on all sides of the House want to deliver what people voted for, want to avoid a no-deal Brexit, and want to avoid the process being strung out interminably. So I welcome the government's latest proposals. Can the Prime Minister assure me that the customs proposals for the Irish border don't involve the construction of any new physical infrastructure, whether at the border or anywhere else?
I'm very grateful I'm very grateful, Mr. Speaker, to my right honourable friend who's taken a keen interest in these matters for a long time and has helped to bring many members together across the House on this question. I can tell him that absolutely not. That it does not. The proposals we are putting forward do not involve physical infrastructure at or near the border, or indeed at any other place, Mr. Speaker.
Jay Swinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the Prime Minister had bothered to go to the Northern Ireland border, he would know the genuine fear that people there feel about his proposals, which they see will result in physical infrastructure for the border, whether that is actually on the border or, as he euphemistically puts it, at some other point in the supply chain. His plans there have been denounced as the worst of both worlds. So, will the Prime Minister now go to the Northern Ireland border and listen to the people and communities there? Or does he just not care?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I of course understand the concerns of people on both sides of the of the Northern Irish border, and indeed across this country. And that's why we are absolutely determined not to have any kind of infrastructure checks at the border or near the border. As I explained to my right honourable friend, they are not necessary. And may I invite her also to support these proposals, and perhaps she could ask her Liberal Democrat colleagues to retract their letter to Jean-Claude Juncker, urging him not to agree to a new deal with the British government.
Mark Francois.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I commend the Prime Minister's emphasis on a future free trade arrangement as his desired end state, which is what many of us have wanted all along. Does he recall that earlier in the year, when the House voted on the so-called indicative votes on a number of different options, a customs union, Norway and so on, all of those were defeated bar one? The one option that has ever passed this House, other than the withdrawal agreement as originally presented, was the so-called Brady Amendment, the essence of which was to expunge the backstop in favour of alternative arrangements, which passed the House of Commons on the 29th of January by 16 votes. Does that give him hope that this could get through?
Yes, it does, Mr. Speaker, and I'm also, it does indeed, Mr. Speaker. I thank my right honourable friend for his point, and he's right also in his ambition for what we can do with this deal, because it does liberate us to do free trade deals around the world and to take back control of our tariffs and our customs. And I'm also fortified by, I think, the knowledge on all sides of this House that this has now been going on for 3.5 years. This does represent a very good basis for a deal, and I hope that colleagues will support it.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. For the last 3 years, it has been government policy that border arrangements between Northern Ireland and the Republic after Brexit would not include checks and controls. That is enshrined in UK law. But now the Prime Minister has announced that there will be customs checks in Northern Ireland, and he has, those are the words he used, and he has entertained the possibility that Northern Ireland will never enter the regulatory zone of which he speaks, because if the Assembly and the Executive don't agree to do so, that will not happen. And as a result, he has abandoned that commitment and risks the return to a hard border. How is that consistent with the joint declaration of 2017 signed by his predecessor, the Good Friday Agreement, and the peace and stability in Northern Ireland that has been so hard won?
Prime Minister.
The right honourable gentleman is absolutely right to lay the emphasis that he does on the Good Friday Agreement and the peace process. And I can tell Mr. Speaker, that in all our conversations we are driven by the need to protect and indeed to fortify that agreement and that process. And I think that this deal that we are setting out gives us the opportunity, gives communities in Northern Ireland the opportunity to build on that process. But I must stress to him that he is mistaken if he believes that it will involve, that any of our proposals will necessitate any kind of checks at the border. That is absolutely untrue. Or indeed any kind of hard border, because that is, I must tell him respectfully, that is untrue.
Sir Graham Brady.
Mr. Speaker, given that this proposal meets the terms set out in the amendment that was passed in this House on the 29th of January, can I urge the Prime Minister to go to his EU colleagues with some confidence and to tell them that there is every likelihood, if not certainty, that this proposition will command the support of the House of Commons and can take us forward and break the deadlock that has been dogging us for so long?
I congratulate my right honourable friend, because it was, after all, his amendment that went to the heart of what I think the House saw as the fundamental problem with the previous withdrawal agreement, and these proposals do indeed address those concerns, and I hope that right honourable members will get behind them.
Anna Soubry.
Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure you will have observed that the Prime Minister's predecessor, at least to her credit, got things in the right order. She got an agreement with the European Union that did command support, it has to be said, in Northern Ireland. The Prime Minister, but she couldn't get it through this place, thinks he's got the support of Parliament, but he hasn't got any support from the European Union, and he hasn't got the support of the people of Northern Ireland. So I congratulate him on getting a deal with the ERG and the DUP. But I remind him that the DUP do not represent the people of Northern Ireland. And I observe they can't even be bothered to turn up today. Could the Prime Minister confirm that not one single other political party or any organisation in Northern Ireland supports his con of a so-called deal?
Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure I was expecting support from the Right Honourable Lady this afternoon, but I had hoped that she would see the advantages of what we're proposing. I do think that it offers a way forward both for the UK and for Ireland and for all communities in Northern Ireland, and it offers a security and stability, and above all, it protects the Good Friday process and a frictionless border. So I hope that it will have her support, Mr. Speaker.
Philip Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When I launched the Better Off Out group in Parliament back in 2006, I could always rely on the now leader of the Labour Party. I could rely on him to vote for my proposals in the voting logs. I'm sorry he's now ditched the only popular policy he ever believed in. Can I ask the Prime Minister whether or not what he's proposed is a final offer to the European Union, and that if they reject his offer out of hand, that it will be the policy of the government to leave the European Union without a deal?
Yes, well, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and I cannot account for the unaccountable. I can't account for the right honourable gentleman opposite's change of mind on the EU, except he seems to have been captured, as I've observed before, by some of his colleagues. But I can certainly confirm to my honourable friend that we will be leaving on October the 31st, deal or no deal.
Lady Herman.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister's proposals prove quite clearly that he does not understand Northern Ireland. While the Prime Minister is perfectly happy, it seems, to dance to the tune of his friends in the Democratic Unionist Party, he forgets or he chooses to ignore the fact, and it is a fact, that the DUP does not represent the majority of people in Northern Ireland. The DUP campaigned for leave, along with the Right Honourable Gentleman. But the majority of people in Northern Ireland voted Remain. The majority of people in Northern Ireland will be extremely concerned by the proposals that he has tabled yesterday and spoken to today, which introduce two borders in Northern Ireland. And may I remind the Prime Minister that the people in Northern Ireland certainly do not want the UK to leave the EU without a deal. What people in Northern Ireland really want, all of them, is to continue to enjoy the peace and stability delivered by the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. I want the Prime Minister to go through the statement he has delivered and pinpoint to the House and the people of Northern Ireland the aspects of his proposals which guarantee peace and stability in Northern Ireland.
I'm grateful to the honourable lady, and I should say the most important thing is that we will abide by every the clause and principle of the Good Friday Agreement. Above all, there will be no border, there will be no hard border at all in Northern Ireland, and most importantly, we will be governed by the principle of consent. And I am more than happy to meet with the Right Honourable Lady to discuss exactly what I mean, if that would be useful to her, because I do accept that these proposals deserve wider circulation and wider explanation. I'd be more than happy to meet with the Right Honourable Lady to go through them.
Alistair Burt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend the tone that the Prime Minister has taken today and the way in which he's answered questions, which fulfils what was my aim when I supported the recent withdrawal bill, which was to encourage the government to pursue a deal as by far the best option going forward in the future. Can I say to him that it's clear that it is unlikely that every part of his proposals are going to be fully accepted. But can I draw the House's attention to the phrase in his letter to Jean-Claude Juncker yesterday, which says, the letter sets out what I regard as a reasonable compromise, the broad landing zone in which I believe a deal can begin to take shape. Does his tone and style today suggest that the compromise that he's been able to put forward has not yet finished, and if there are needs to handle some of the difficult issues that have been raised, he is still open in that frame of mind to take this forward, because a deal would now seem to be achievable if that tone is continued?
Well, of course, my right honourable friend is right in what in his surmise about our intentions. But I think perhaps for the benefit of the House and for people watching, people should be reminded that what the UK has done is already very considerable. We have already moved quite some way, and I hope that our friends and partners across the Channel do understand it, and I hope that my right honourable friend understands that as well. We have gone the extra mile. What we are doing both on agri-foods and on goods, with the principle of consent, is, I think, a very considerable move towards compromise.
Hey, Cooper.
Well, the Prime Minister agreed to give evidence to the Liaison Committee before the European Council on this. And can he also confirm that he's proposing to remove the provisions in Article 4 of the Annex, in particular the commitment not to reduce fundamental rights at work, occupational health and safety, fair working conditions and employment standards? So can he confirm that, far from increasing workers' rights and the protection from workers' rights, as many on this side have urged him to do, he is in fact proposing to reduce the protection for workers' rights and making it easier for Conservative governments to do what they've always done and cut workers' rights?
Mr. Speaker, the Right Honourable Lady is, I think, in error if she thinks that that's our intention. We are going to be ensuring that this country has the highest standards for workers' rights and for environmental protections, and I'd be more than happy to meet the Right Honourable Lady to explain what we're going to do.
Stephen Crabb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend the Prime Minister on the serious intent and effort that he's adopting with regards to these negotiations? He is proving many of his doubters wrong. And does he agree with me that the constructive tone that we heard overnight from EU counterparts stands in stark contrast to the tone adopted by the opposition? Continue to set their face against their own voters.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I thoroughly agree with my right honourable friend, and I hope that all colleagues on all sides of the House will think very carefully about the terms of the deal that we're setting out. I'm more than happy, as I've said, to discuss them and to explain what we're trying to do, but I think it is incumbent on all of us to get this thing done, get it over the line. I think that is what the overwhelming majority of our electorate want us to do. Whether they voted Leave or Remain, people want us now to speak up for democracy.
Ben Bradshaw.
Breaking the Good Friday Agreement, risking 20 years of peace, creating 2 new hard borders and a smuggler's paradise in Northern Ireland, and scrapping all of the labour regulations, environmental standards and other standards in the rest of the United Kingdom. This is nothing like what he peddled to the voters in 2016, is it? So why is he scared of putting this back to the people for their consent in a referendum?
Mr. Speaker, I I don't wish to be unnecessarily adversarial today, but it seems a satirical thing for the party opposite, the gentleman opposite, to say when that party is refusing to concede to a general election. We are very happy with. I'm very happy to discuss these ideas with the honourable gentleman. They in no way correspond to the caricature that he just put to the House. This is a very serious way forward, and it gives this country the opportunity to improve our environmental and social welfare standards.
James Brokenshire.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I commend my right honourable friend on his clear intent to securing that we leave with a deal on the 31st of October. He has set out a detailed and considered proposal, and despite the protestations of the party opposite, I hope that the EU will engage with them constructively. In this context, he will feel as keenly as I do the continuing absence of a fully functioning Northern Ireland executive. What further steps will he take to get Stormont back up and running? And what assurance can he give to the people of Northern Ireland on the absolute need for political decision-making in its absence?
Prime Minister.
My right honourable friend has a wealth of experience in this matter and did a huge amount of good both for Northern Ireland and in the cause of trying to get Stormont up and running again. Clearly what this deal would offer is the opportunity for the Executive and Assembly of Northern Ireland, the people of Northern Ireland, to have even more of a say in their own destiny. And in that sense, it takes forward and builds on the peace process, one of the great achievements of the last 30 years. So I think that it is full of hope for the people of Northern Ireland, but in my view it gives them an extra incentive to get Stormont up and running, and I can assure him that we are working very hard to do just that.
Rangfield.
May I welcome the Prime Minister's statement? May we have a vote on it before he goes to the European Summit? And would he, in the political declaration, affirm what he said to the House, that this country will be a leader in protecting workers' rights, consumer rights and the environment?
Yes, well, I'm really grateful to my right honourable friend, and I hope that he speaks for many colleagues across the House in wanting to get this thing forward. I will reflect on what he said about having a vote on it. I think it would probably be better to get a deal first. I'm confident that we can get one, and I hope it will command the support of others. And I can certainly reassure him on his point about standards for workers' rights and for the environment. It is the intention of this government to go higher still.
David Gork.
The publication of specific proposals to deal with the backstop is to be welcomed. The Prime Minister's commitment to not having physical infrastructure in Northern Ireland or the Republic of Ireland is also to be welcomed, and the Prime Minister's commitment to the Good Friday Agreement is to be welcomed. But could the Prime Minister say a little bit more about what obligations he believes we have under the Good Friday Agreement to ensure that not only is there no physical infrastructure, but that goods can flow freely between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland?
Well, I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, and of course what this offer does is take one step further in, by consent, having regulatory alignment for goods as well, so obviating, Mr. Speaker, the need for checks on perhaps 30% of the traffic north-south, in addition to the 30% that we've already achieved by sanitary and phytosanitary alignment, always assuming that consent were to be granted, if he understands me.
Dr. Sarah Wollaston.
Mr. Speaker, the principle of consent requires people to be able to weigh up the risks and the benefits of the actual deal as opposed to the promises that were made during the referendum. I'm afraid there are many detailed questions arising out of the Prime Minister's statement. and they can't be answered in this format. So can I ask the Prime Minister when he will keep the clear commitment he gave to appear before select committee chairs at the liaison committee, and will he do so before Parliament prorogues?
Mr. Speaker, I'm absolutely committed to appearing before the Honourable Lady's committee, and she will have an answer within an hour of my departure from the chamber this afternoon.
Dr. Greg Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Most people in this House and the country want to have a good deal with the EU. So can I welcome very much the pragmatic approach and the demeanour that my right honourable friend has taken today, and look to our European neighbours, and I might say the Leader of the Opposition, to respond in kind. He set out a new Northern Ireland protocol, which would kick in if and only if we have not yet concluded a free trade agreement. So can I ask my right honourable friend, is it his expectation that should the protocol be needed, it would be intended to be temporary? And is it also his expectation that it would involve zero tariffs between the UK and the EU?
The answer to both questions is in the affirmative, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my right honourable friend for his constructive attitude to this, and if there are any more details that he needs to establish from me, Mr. Speaker, I'm only too happy to share them.
Pat McFadden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With regard to the regulation of goods side of this, not the customs, the regulation of goods, the government's explanatory note says that these arrangements must receive the endorsement of the Northern Ireland Assembly, and executive paragraph 13 of the paper says this must happen before the end of the transition period and every 4 years afterwards. Can he confirm that what this means is that even if these proposals were to be agreed by the European Union, and even if they were subsequently agreed by this House, if they were not then approved by the Northern Ireland Assembly during the transition period, they would only last for a year, following which we would have no commitment to the common regulatory system that is essential for the open border.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman is making a very valid point, if I may say, but the mechanism of consent is clearly vital, and we are in the midst of discussions with our friends about exactly how it should work. But I won't hide it from the House. He is making a legitimate point, but we will, I'm sure, solve this question during the discussions about consent.
Sir John Hayes.
Mr. Speaker, the test of reasonableness is one understood by legislators, and compromise, as the Prime Minister has said already, is intrinsic to all negotiations. But what the British people are most frustrated about is what they perceive as displacement and dither and delay. So will the Prime Minister be clear in his decisive determination that he continues to personify that spirit of getting on, getting out and getting ahead?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and that is exactly what we intend to do. And the purpose of this deal, these proposals, is to get Brexit done, Mr. Speaker, and for us all to move on as a country and move on together. I do believe they represent a very good way forward for the UK. They will enable us to do free trade deals. They will enable us to regulate our own laws and our own system, and above all, Mr. Speaker, they will enable the UK to leave the EU, as the people of this country were promised, whole and entire, and to protect our precious union with Northern Ireland.
Ms. Savile Roberts.
Now, the Prime Minister's blame game goes down very well on the stage-managed Tory conference platform, but I wonder whether he has stress-tested the technical details of his proposals on the UK's constitution, or did he only require the DUP's consent? Now, I note that his proposal claims to equip the Stormont Assembly with the levers to control the direction of Northern Ireland's national question. Does he not agree that this sets an interesting precedent for the Senedd to be equipped to review Wales's constitutional relationship with Westminster every 4 years too? Or does he just hope and pray that somebody will stop him?
Barrister.
As the Right Honourable Lady knows, there is a unique situation in Northern Ireland under the Good Friday Agreement, and what I think we're proposing today gives this country the opportunity to develop and intensify that. But I'm willing to listen to her pleas for the Senate, and I will consider them closely.
Sir Geoffrey Clifton Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe this represents a significant step towards breaking the deadlock which businesses and the vast majority of this people want to see. Can my honourable friend confirm that in the spirit of goodwill now generated on both sides of the Channel, he will negotiate 24 hours a day, exhibiting every flexibility to get a deal?
I will strain every sinew, Mr. Speaker. In fact, it was only my desire to appear before you and the House today that restrained me from going off to other European capitals and selling this project.
We're delighted to hear it. Christian Matheson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Prime Minister not accept that a customs post that is sited 20 miles away from a border still represents a hard border, and therefore it goes against the Good Friday Agreement? Why is he willing to prioritise Brexit against the Good Friday Agreement?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I should remind the honourable gentleman that there has been a fiscal border for many years between the UK and Ireland, a fiscal border, and customs checks do not mean customs posts or infrastructure of any kind, as I'm sure he appreciates. And if he doesn't, then Mr. Speaker, I'm more than happy to share with him our thinking and to explain how it can be done.
Philip Dunn. Mr. Dunn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I remind my right honourable friend that I voted Remain in the referendum. I voted to deliver Brexit in this House ever since. And can I congratulate him on the constructive proposals that he's put forward and wish him every good fortune that the EU will engage with them as they need to. And can I remind the House, and perhaps he could confirm, that existing trade across the border in Northern Ireland takes place with different currencies, with different VAT rates, as he's just been elucidating, without the need for any physical infrastructure, and customs arrangements, following the excellent work done on the Alternative Arrangements Commission, can do the same.
I thank my right honourable friend, and if I may say so, I think he speaks with the voice of common sense and pragmatic understanding of the realities that obtain, but also the right measure of optimism about what we can achieve. Thank you, and I thank him very much.
Patricia Gibson.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that the House is, like me, is hugely impressed by the Prime Minister's attempts to avoid an Irish border, and this resulted in him creating two borders. Clearly, he is not familiar with the contents of the Good Friday Agreement. Given that these proposals are doomed to fail on all counts, and as he seeks to blame the EU for his failure, will he confirm that if he cannot secure agreement, he will obey the law set out in the Benn Act, or instead will he have to die in a ditch?
Mr. Speaker, I reject the suggestion that what we are doing is not in conformity with the Good Friday Agreement. Indeed, it is intended to build on the Good Friday Agreement, and if it would help the honourable lady, I'd be more than happy to talk to her about our plans and to elucidate her on the matter.
Steve Brine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the 3rd of September, I asked the Prime Minister for some evidence of an emerging deal. You will remember it well. Last week I asked him again, and I thank him then for the outline of the detail that he gave in response to me. Today I don't need to do that, because he set out some real meat to Mr. Juncker in his letter. And I'm very, very pleased to see it, Mr. Speaker. I knew he wanted a deal, and he told me he wanted a deal, and I believe him. So can he confirm that consent in Northern Ireland lies at the heart of this over there, but more importantly, compromise over here in this House of Commons is at the heart of getting this done, and those who want to avoid no deal, like me, like him,
need to now do the right thing and vote for a deal.
I thank my honourable friend, but for whom I have a high regard, and I well remember our conversation a few weeks ago, and I think he makes his point with great clarity and force, Mr. Speaker. Those who oppose a no-deal Brexit, and I appreciate the sincerity of the feelings of those who oppose a no-deal Brexit, they logically really should support this way forward, and I hope that they do.
George Howarth.
Mr. Speaker, as a former Northern Ireland Minister, I'm all too painfully aware of how fragile the arrangements are. And the Prime Minister's proposal, as my honourable friend for Wolverhampton South East pointed out, are all contingent upon the periodic renewal by the Executive and Assembly of his proposals. Doesn't he realise that will only add to the fragile political situation that already exists in Northern Ireland? Isn't there a case to consider, given particularly that the Executive and Assembly aren't even up and running, putting the case directly to the people of Northern Ireland in the form of a referendum to see what they think about it?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure that referendums have a great history in our country recently of bringing people together. And if I may say so, I think what these proposals... I mean, I appreciate his, the right honourable gentleman's experience and the sincerity with which he approaches this subject. I do, and he's right, obviously, to raise the concerns of both communities, but I think that this offers a way forward for both communities, and it is very important that the views of all communities are respected, and that's why the principle of consent is at the heart of what we're proposing.
David Jones.
I commend my right honourable friend on putting forward these positive proposals, which merit an equally positive response from the European Union. He's mentioned the need for amendments to the political declaration, the significance of which is frequently understated. I assume that this includes the deletion of the reference to building and improving on the single customs territory, but can my right honourable friend say what other amendments he considers will be necessary?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, in due course, the text will of course be made available to honourable and right honourable members, though this is a negotiation, Mr. Speaker, and you will appreciate that we have to hold some things back, but I can certainly confirm to him that there will be no reference to the improving on the customs union the way that he has described, and the purpose of the political declaration will be to set out how we wish to develop our relationship with our European friends in a positive way, protecting standards, as I've said several times, insisting on the highest possible standards in this country, but also giving us the opportunity to develop a fantastic new free trade relationship, and that's what we're going to do.
Luciana Berger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In an earlier answer, the Prime Minister alluded to the fact that he had support from business for his plan, and yet the director of the Northern Ireland Retail Consortium has said that the Prime Minister's plan is both unworkable and unpalatable. Will the Prime Minister point to one business that moves goods into Northern Ireland that supports his plan?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I've met many businesses in Northern Ireland who want emphatically to get a deal, and that is the overwhelming view of businesses in Northern Ireland, and I hope very much, therefore, that she will support them in their ambition.
Stephen Hammond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I, like my right honourable friends for Tunbridge Wells and North East Bedfordshire, can I say to the Prime Minister I warmly welcome the fact that proposals have been put down and the constructive tone in which he's undertaken proceedings this morning. I'm keen to understand some of the points of detail. So I understand there's going to be a change also to the political declaration of free trade arrangement zero tariffs. Can he then confirm that he intends that those zero tariffs, which will require some checks as well, will not be at the border and will be of a nature that will be of relatively de minimis?
Yes. Yes, and not only that, Mr. Speaker, but I can confirm that there will be no checks, as it were, from NI to GB. And that's very important, I think, for the House to understand.
Alison McGovern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister said some moments ago that the history of referenda in this country wasn't good, but can I just remind him that by 71% the Good Friday Agreement was passed by a referendum. But can I turn the Prime Minister to the detail of his statement today? On page 3, he refers to the regulatory zone for Northern Ireland, and he says the Assembly will vote again every 4 years, and if consent were withheld, these arrangements would then lapse after 1 year. Lapse back to what?
Minister.
Obviously, Mr. Speaker, the default position is that Northern Ireland is part of the UK, and part of the UK legal order and part of the UK customs territory, and will remain part of the UK's customs territory under any circumstances. What we're proposing is alignment on agri-foods and also on industrial goods, and that is to be done by consent. I think it offers a very attractive way forward, and I hope that the House will get behind it.
Mr. Peter Bowe.
Speaker, can I ask the Prime Minister a little bit more about the political declaration? Do I understand that it's going to be changed to say the UK and the EU will use the best endeavours to achieve a fantastic free trade agreement? But could I ask what would happen if we got to the end of the transition period, and when that end would be? What would then happen if there isn't a free trade agreement?
Well, I think in that very unlikely event, obviously the UK and the EU would revert to WTO terms. But I don't think that is likely. I think that the UK and the EU will be very keen, both parties, to strike a great free trade agreement. And that is what we will do, and that is what we will set out in the political declaration.
Graham Morris.
Mr. Speaker, more than a week ago, the Prime Minister told the House, in response to a question from my good and honourable friend, the member for Ashfield, that he would publish the previous EU withdrawal bill within days. Now, that's important because it could form the basis, with amendments, to move forward and break the deadlock, amendments on workers' rights, health and safety and environmental standards. So will the Prime Minister honour that commitment and publish the bill?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we will of course publish the legislation in due course.
Sir Henry Bellingham.
Can I congratulate the Prime Minister on his statesmanship and indeed ingenuity in delivering an offer that's serious and credible, and if my emails are anything to go by, there's huge support in my constituency. Can I take him to 1B of the protocol notes, which makes it clear that 100% of these unique areas of collaboration will continue? Will you find time to ring the Taoiseach and tell him that there are going to be many areas for joint collaboration on community projects, on pushing enterprise and investment and wealth creation on both sides of the border?
I thank my right honourable friend, and he's in fact I talked to the Taoiseach, of course, last night, and expect to be talking to him quite a lot in the days to come, Mr. Speaker, and I will certainly make that point to him as well, and it's something we've already discussed.
Harry Shearman.
Mr. Speaker, would the Prime Minister agree that most of the people in this country are not extreme Remainers or extreme Brexiteers? Surely it is his job, and this House's job now, to look at a deal. This is a bit of a deal we've heard today, a full look. Perhaps we should restart the cross-party discussion so that he can evade the conclusion that he has to break the law and leave without a deal. Could we restart sensible negotiations again?
Prime Minister.
Of course, Mr. Speaker. I have a high regard for the right honourable gentleman opposite, and I remember having many useful discussions with him about higher education when I did that job. I'd be more than happy to talk to him about what we're proposing and the way it can take our country forward and bring us back together.
Oh, Sir Peter Bottomley.
Can I say that as someone who 30 years ago served as Minister of Agriculture in Northern Ireland, that both there and in the UK, the deal and proposed transition matter, and the issues will have to be dealt with whether we crash out or whether we go with the deal. So I hope we do go with the deal. I think the majority in the House. And can I say to my friend the Prime Minister, it'd be a good thing if you could arrange to rescind the withdrawal of the Conservative whip from those of my colleagues who should be back on our side fully.
Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'm defer to my right honourable friend for his long-standing experience in Northern Ireland, but I think that the agreement that we have, or the deal that we're proposing, is a very good one for Northern Ireland. And as for his suggestion on our colleagues, all I can say is that the consequences of the Surrender Act, and I use that term advisedly, are very serious for our ability to negotiate. And I hope very much that, notwithstanding those difficulties, this House will come together and get a deal over the line. That is the, if I may say so, that if to bring the whole country together and to bring this House together, I think that would be the best way forward.
Stephen Doughty.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has spoken a number of times about consent, but I would urge him, particularly the only representative we have here in this House at the moment speaking for Northern Ireland is the Honourable Lady for North Down, and I would urge him to listen very carefully to what she said, because he talks about consent. It is very clear this morning that there is not consent from many of the other parties in Northern Ireland, many people across the different communities, nor from the business community, nor from Dublin and from the Irish government. So I would urge him to listen very, very carefully to that. There is a very simple way through this, and that is to put a credible deal back to the people, including the people of Northern Ireland, for a confirmatory vote. And I urge him to look at that very closely. And will he confirm how his proposals are in line with Section 10(2) of the EU Withdrawal Act 2018? Because I do not believe that they are.
Mr. Speaker, they are completely in line with Section 10 of the Withdrawal Act, and I'd be happy to demonstrate that to him. But on his request for a second referendum, I really can't think of anything more divisive or wasteful of this country's time. But if if the honourable gentleman wants an election, then why doesn't he talk to his right honourable friend in front of him?
Colleagues, I'm very grateful to the large number of people who've come up to the chair expressing concern about my throat, and their generosity of spirit and humanity are much appreciated. But I just want to take the opportunity to confirm to the House that the state of my throat, which is purely temporary, is not down to the consumption of a kangaroo's testicle.
What type of testicle was
I wouldn't eat it. It would probably be poisoned. And John Barron.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm glad to hear it. The devil will be in the detail, but I very much congratulate my right honourable friend on his improved proposals as a basis for a deal. But in straining every sinew to secure a good deal, will he be resolute, not only in his intent to honour the triggering of Article 50 by an overwhelming majority in this place, which clearly stated that we would leave with or without a deal, but also resolute in ensuring that we are actually prepared for no deal? Because it is an inescapable logic that by being so prepared, it improves the chances of securing such a deal, despite that logic escaping the parties opposite.
My right honourable friend is absolutely right, and it's thanks to the preparations that we've made for that outcome, for a no-deal exit, and I thank my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, for everything that he is doing. That has unquestionably, notwithstanding the Surrender Act, notwithstanding the Surrender Act, has concentrated the minds of our friends in the EU and is helping us to get a deal.
And David Hanson.
Could the Prime Minister genuinely help me? In paragraph 9 of his explanatory note, he says the traders moving goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland will need a new notification requirement regarding the nature of goods in the consignment, people sending, exporting and importing goods, where the goods will depart and arrive, and that these arrangements will not be affected until the transition period is completed. As the Honourable Lady for North Down said, that is effectively a second border. Could he tell the House how many of those transactions he anticipates each year and what the cost of that is to businesses and to the government in establishing that system?
I'm grateful. I can assure the honourable gentleman that insofar as such checks are necessary, they will be done electronically, they will be done by UK officials, and they will only be instituted with the consent of Northern Ireland. I think that's the important point. But I'm more than happy, if he would like, I'm more than happy to discuss it more with him in person, if that would be useful.
Jack Lepresti.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend and congratulate my honourable friend on his statement and on his valiant efforts to secure us a deal and get us out of the European Union on the 31st of October. But may I ask him a question which a lot of my constituents are asking me, that when we finally leave on the 31st of October, that if it were to be without a deal, there will be no adverse effect on any UK-European defence collaboration, especially in the field of procurement, manufacture and wider operations.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and I can tell him that we are proceeding with a huge collaborations across the front with our European friends, and I have no reason to believe that any of them will be interrupted.
Peter Kyle.
Mr. Speaker, from the outset of negotiations, the British government has understandably had its red lines. They are long-standing and unchangeable red lines. It's understandable also that our negotiating partners in the EU would have their red lines, which they have stuck to rigidly throughout this. Today and last night, the Irish Taoiseach has said that the proposals that the Prime Minister has laid before the House today break those red lines and are unacceptable to them. In his words, it's a non-starter. Why has the Prime Minister brought before the House proposals which are simply unacceptable to the EU? They are breaking their red lines they have had from the outset. If they had done the same to us, he would be using the most outrageous language against them, and yet he has brought something here which is completely unacceptable from the outset. Why?
Prime Minister.
I appreciate that the honourable gentleman follows these things very closely, but I don't recognise, I may say, Mr. Speaker, the characterisation that he has given of the response from our EU friends, even in Dublin.
Victoria Prentice.
I hope the Prime Minister can hear the collective sigh of relief, which tends to indicate that this might be the beginning of the end. Will he join with me? Oh, we're nowhere near the end of the beginning. Will he join with me in encouraging everybody in this House to come together, whether or not as part of the marvellous group MPs for a deal? And will he reach out to MPs from all sides and deal with their genuine concerns on the details of this agreement in the coming weeks?
I thank my honourable friend for everything that she does to bring colleagues together on this issue. I don't know whether this is the end of the beginning or the beginning of the second half of the middle, or exactly where we are in this process. But there is, I think, momentum now behind these proposals. And I'm not going to pretend that this will be easy, and I'm not going to pretend that this is a done deal, Mr. Speaker, because I think honourable members are right to be cautious. But the UK has moved a long way. The UK has moved a long way, and I hope that our partners will recognise that and move correspondingly.
Anne Clwyd.
As the Prime Minister has repeatedly demonstrated this morning, the information about the political declaration is very vague indeed, and it wouldn't protect jobs, rights or security, and doesn't seek to address the major reasons why we on this side oppose the deal put forward 3 times by the previous Prime Minister. And can he also tell us what how the European Parliament, how does he think they are going to react to his proposals? Has he had any contact with them at all? Any indication what they are feeling?
Yes, certainly. I've of course talked to the President of the European Parliament, in which she served with such distinction, and I can tell her and tell the House that what the European Parliament overwhelmingly wants is a deal rather than no deal, and I'm sure that they will see this as the basis of a very good deal.
Bob Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister knows that my constituency
probably had as close to a statistical dead heat of a result in the referendum as was possible. A tiny margin to remain, which was my own view. But he also knows that throughout that time thereafter, my constituents and I have urged that this House needs to come together and find a deal and go forward. And I therefore welcome what he has done today. I certainly support it as one who took a different view initially, but will he also recognise that the concern and distress that my constituents have is that there are some people, I regret to say on the opposite side of this House, who seem to rubbish every attempt at compromise, every attempt at a constructive way forward, and that frankly the country and they deserve better than that. And we should give this a fair chance.
Well said. I thank my right honourable friend, and I think as somebody, and I know that he is a passionate pro-European to the depths of his soul, Mr. Speaker, and I respect him profoundly for his desire to get on, do a deal, get Brexit done, and then build a new partnership with our European friends, which is what we want to do.
Hey, Green.
Manufacturers in my constituency operate an integrated trading model whereby they ship goods directly from Manchester to the Republic of Ireland for distribution across the whole of the island of Ireland. Can the Prime Minister explain to me how the deal he's proposing now offers them more certainty, fewer burdens and less cost, both than they have now and they would have had under the backstop?
All those freedoms would continue, and I can reassure the honourable lady that, as I've said many times, there would be no checks for our part on goods coming from the EU, that's to say from Ireland into Northern Ireland, into the UK.
Maria Caulfield.
Speaker, is the Prime Minister encouraged that, given the empty benches opposite on Monday when we were debating important Northern Ireland issues, that members have found their enthusiasm once again for all things Northern Ireland? And does he agree with me that any customs checks do not have to be done on the border, do not have to be done in customs posts, can be done at points of origin and destination, as the Northern Ireland Select Committee heard in evidence?
My honourable friend speaks with the technological optimism that I think has too long been absent from this debate. That is the way forward. I think everybody understands that. That's what we're going to bring to those solutions. And this agreement, I think, offers a way of doing that at a pace and a timescale that will reassure businesses on both sides and agricultural interests on both sides of the border.
On break.
I commend the Prime Minister for rare consistency. When he said F business, he really meant it. Manufacturing Northern Ireland has described his proposals as an existential threat and being thrown under the bus. Can the Prime Minister confirm which businesses in Northern Ireland he consulted about his proposals and which of them supported them?
All the Northern Ireland businesses that came to number 10 recently supported a deal, and it would be invidious to pick any one of them, Mr. Speaker, but I won't be given any lessons about consistency from the Liberal Democrats who called for a referendum and now say they want, that if there were to be a second referendum, they would campaign against the result, Mr. Speaker.
Neil Parish. Mr. Barrett.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I very much welcome the Prime Minister's statement? Can I also welcome his enthusiasm? Because for 2.5 years there's been so much negativity in this House. We just cannot get this deal through. So for goodness sake, can we get the deal done? And does he believe that it will then lead on to a good trade deal so that farming, agriculture, business will not have to pay tariffs in the European Union and we can export across the whole of the world?
Mr. Speaker, and I can tell him that Somerset lamb and cattle and beef and Devon, I should say, Devon, Devon and Somerset.
Although he farms in Somerset.
He does farm in Somerset. And it's
Somerset and Devon.
Somerset and Devon, beef and lamb, will have the opportunity to find export markets which at the moment are I'm afraid prevented by our current arrangements, such as in the United States and indeed elsewhere. And I think we have a glorious future ahead of us if we just take the first few steps.
Dr. Rupa Haaq.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the Prime Minister is looking for ways for his proposals to pass, can I say that I agree with my near West London neighbour that all our constituents want to move on from this intractable stalemate? And can I say to him that I would allow the final version of his deal through if it came, along with many people on this side and many on that side, some of him that he's kicked out of his own party, possibly even his own brother, if it came subject to a confirmatory referendum, disentangled from all the election gimmickry, and then allow them to have the final say. If it's as fantastic as he says, he has nothing to fear.
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I say that I warmly welcome the first half of the Honourable Lady's question.
Mr. Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we now glimpse the possibility of a tolerable deal, and I congratulate my right honourable friend on what he's done to make that possible. But can he just reassure me that he's going to be able to make progress towards that advanced free trade agreement which we've both so long wanted to achieve, despite the Surrender Act which people have voted for opposite?
Well, it is with no little sense of relief, Mr. Speaker, that I listened to my honourable friend, though he and I have talked a lot in the last few days, and I knew that was broadly his view. This is an opportunity to get this done, to do it in a way that I think satisfies all the requirements that we have set out, above all the peace process in Northern Ireland, but also allows the whole of the UK to take back control of our tariffs and our customs, and to do free trade deals around the world in exactly the way that he has described and he has campaigned for so many years.
Leslie.
Well, the Prime Minister is clearly trying his best to placate members on his own side, but please stop the pretence that this is a proposal for anything other than a hard border on the island of Ireland. Well, tariffs, checks, inspections, a customs frontier, these are not compatible. They're not compatible with the Good Friday Agreement. I really don't know who he thinks he's kidding. This is too important, too much is at stake for him to just brush aside the consequences purely for the party political interests of the Conservative Party.
Mr. Speaker, I think that the former Shadow Treasury Minister should know that there already is a fiscal border in Northern Ireland, and far from adding to checks, what we are doing, as he will understand, and I think the House understands today, is making a very considerable move forward by saying that we will allow, by consent, regulatory alignment, both for sanitary and phytosanitary goods and agri-foods, and also for industrial and manufacturing goods. That is a pragmatic way forward. We're doing it by democratic consent. I think it's a method of solving the issue that should commend itself to moderate opinion on all sides of the House.
Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the referendum, the Right Honourable Gentleman held out the prospect of frictionless trade with the European Union. Whatever else one says about these proposals, and I think he's acknowledged this, this is not frictionless. What are the reasons why it hasn't been possible to deliver what was promised?
Mr. Speaker, this will be frictionless trade at the frontier. There will be no borders, there will be no checks, there will be no customs checks at the frontier. But of course, there may be de minimis customs checks, but not at the frontier and with no physical incarnation or physical infrastructure. And I think he's raising a very important point, because as the UK comes out of the EU and as we go to a zero tariff, zero quota free trade deal, it will also be incumbent on us to use this experience that we're going through now as we develop our relations with the EU as a whole, and as we develop the systems, the frictionless systems by which UK-EU trade will continue to operate.
Buzz Elwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This has been a long and frustrating journey, and very sadly, I think one that the Labour front branch wishes to prolong. Could I commend the Prime Minister on his efforts to break the Brexit impasse and seek a compromise that not only this Parliament can live and work with, but the nation can as well? Would my right honourable friend agree the more voices here in this Parliament, especially from across the House, that express their approval in the national interest, the more powerful message this will send to Brussels as they meet for that critical meeting next week?
Well, I thank my right honourable friend, and he is entirely right. And I know that he has campaigned passionately on this subject, and I know that his own voice is important in this matter. And I know how influential he can be also in reaching out across the House, and I hope very much to work with him to do that.
Brendan O'Hara.
Speaker, how would the Prime Minister sell this potentially ruinous proposal to the farmers and shellfish producers in my strongly Remain Argyll and Bute constituency, who will be able to see just 12 miles across the water their Northern Ireland counterparts being allowed free and unfettered access to the single market? If this is good enough for Northern Ireland, why is it not good enough for Scotland? Or are my constituents simply expendable?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I find that a slightly ironic question, given that it is the avowed policy of the Scottish Nationalist Party to give back control of Scotland's stupendous marine wealth to Brussels.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I congratulate my right honourable friend not only for his proposals, but his ability now to bring together all those of us across this House that wish to leave the European Union with a deal. Our exchanges today will be observed by our European Union friends, and our ability to negotiate that deal will often be the subject of, do they trust this House to pass the deal that is finally agreed? So can I commend my right honourable friend to think of having a vote in this House to test his negotiating strategy, to demonstrate to our European Union friends that we are behind him.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and as I've said before to a colleague who raised this, I will reflect on that suggestion. I think it would be more conventional to do the deal. I think that is what the Act prescribes, to do the deal and then bring it to this House. And I think that's probably what this House would prefer, but I'm happy to have discussions on that matter.
Paul Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hearing the proceedings today, it seems increasingly that this is an internal debate within the Conservative Party rather than a meaningful attempt at international diplomacy. And I hear the outcry from the Treasury bench, but the reality is the Irish Deputy Prime Minister, Simon Coveney, has said this morning that they could not possibly support the proposals by the Prime Minister, and they should come back with something fit for purpose. And elaborating on that, he says that we cannot support any proposal that suggests one party, or indeed a minority in Northern Ireland, could make the decision for the majority and how it would be implemented. So I urge the Prime Minister, how would you respond to that challenge if this is going to be workable?
I'm grateful to him, Mr. Speaker, and he's raising, I may say, an important point. I listened carefully to what my friend Simon Coveney had to say, and we must get the mechanism of consent right, so that all communities, both communities, feel reassured about it. And I'm very happy to discuss it not only with Simon Coveney in Dublin, but also, of course, with the honourable gentleman.
Robin Halfon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Harlow, we've already seen the NHS Brexit dividend with a brand new hospital. The people of Harlow will feel that those who vote against this excellent deal, that it is really that they want to stop Brexit completely. Can my honourable friend confirm that once we do this deal, that we will, when we leave the EU, gain control of our tax rates and be able to reduce VAT and energy bills for our hard-working constituents?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and not only will we be able to reduce VAT in the UK, we'll be able to do it in Northern Ireland as well.
Deirdre Brock.
Okay. Now that the Prime Minister has established the principle that different parts of the UK can have different EU status, Scotland must at least be entitled to claim her place in the single market and customs union. When will that proposal be put to the EU?
I think that most people in this House do understand that the Good Friday Agreement does impose particular requirements on the governance of Northern Ireland. It is a unique situation. And as for the question that she raises, the people of Scotland had a referendum in 2014. They voted very substantially to remain part of the UK, and they were told it was a once-in-a-generation decision.
Robert Courts.
Mr. Speaker, may I also welcome these reasonable compromise proposals that we've heard today. Would the Prime Minister please confirm that when we speak of customs checks, we must be very careful not to conflate administrative customs procedures that can take place at a warehouse with physical customs checks at a border, and that the latter are not required, are not proposed in his proposals, and aren't needed even for the excise checks that take place at present?
If I may say so, I think my honourable friend has put his finger on the heart of the question, and he's entirely right. That is the distinction. I think it is very important for all right honourable members to bear in mind as they approach this question. We can solve this problem through exactly the means that he describes.
Melanie on.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I press the Prime Minister on exactly how he plans to ascertain the consent of the people of Northern Ireland? And not just how, when is he going to do that?
I'm very grateful, and she's raising, if I may say, the crucial question, one of the crucial questions that these proposals evoke. It is obviously now for discussion with our friends, not just in Dublin but around the EU. We do think there's a way forward. I'm happy to keep her abreast of our way forward as we go there. But it must be done one way or another by consent.
James Cartledge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given his busy schedule, I don't know if my right friend would have had time to read the EU's latest FTA, which is with Vietnam. But even a cursory glance shows that the entire agreement is based on tariff reductions in exchange for market access. Does this not show, firstly, that it's fanciful to believe we could somehow leave the EU and stay in the customs union and get these type of trade deals? And secondly, is it not a reminder that when we leave, the EU will be negotiating its own trade deals, and that therefore it will be in both parties' interest to have a technological way to deal with variations in respective territories' tariff schedules?
Again, Mr. Speaker, I congratulate my friend because he speaks with the voice of technological optimism, and he understands the details of these questions very well, and that is indeed the way forward for this country. There is a wealth of opportunity that will open up if we have the courage to take these steps.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has denied now on multiple occasions during this session that what he is proposing involves physical customs checks. But he has just said in his statement in relation to the new protocol and custom checks that there will be, and I quote, and this is on page 3 of his statement, a number of cases where physical checks would be necessary. Is he denying he has said that? And secondly, he refers to the political declaration. It is a declaration of aspiration with no legal force. Is it not the case that the free trade agreement he's referring to will take at least 3 years to negotiate? Nothing's going to get done by this at all.
Well, as the honourable gentleman knows, there already are some checks for epidemiological purposes between GB and NI. If there are to be new checks down the Irish Sea, they will be de minimis. They will not be on the GB side, and they will be done by UK officials. And no, there will be no new border posts or borders. There will be de minimis checks, and whatever checks there may be will be done by consent and only introduced by consent. And there will certainly be no checks on the GB side, because this is entirely dependent on whether the EU wants them, Mr. Speaker. And on his second point about the political declaration, that will chart a way forward for the UK-EU relationship that will be ambitious and positive and allow us to build a new partnership, which I hope that he will find invigorating and that he will support.
David Duquette.
Mr. Speaker, I do have a question on the proposal, but can I start by countering with great respect? some of the claims made from the benches opposite. Chief among them, the claim from the member for Argyll and Bute, who I thought may have mentioned something about the growth deal for Argyll and Bute that was announced earlier this week with some gratitude. But in terms of the proposals, if they were to vote for this deal, of course, the problems he described wouldn't exist. And even if in the event of a no deal, if he could maybe encourage his colleagues in the Scottish Government to pass on some of the money from the UK Government to local authorities for environmental health inspectors, that would be extremely helpful. And in terms of the... I'll get on with the question in that case. Thank you very much. My question on the proposal for the Prime Minister is, if this proposal, when this proposal goes ahead and gets accepted, it replaces the backstop. So come the end of the implementation period, can he confirm that that will be no later than December 2020? And when we get to that point, because we've replaced the backstop, there will be no need for any further extension of 1 year, 2 years, or any extension whatsoever.
That is entirely right, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend and congratulate him on everything he does to promote the interests of Scottish fishing, where, if I may say, he shows great leadership and vision. And under these proposals, under our proposals, Scotland would take back control of Scotland's fishing grounds and be able to turn them to the advantage of the people of Scotland. And I'm sad to say that the SNP would hand back control of Scottish fishing to Brussels.
Gavin Newlands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I know the Prime Minister is hopeful of restoring Stormont. We all are right across this House, but it's by no means assured. If he miraculously succeeds to secure a deal, but efforts to restore Stormont fail, will this government implement direct rule in Northern Ireland to enforce the measures in this proposal?
Mr. Speaker, we're working very hard to restore Stormont, and I'm sure that has the complete support of the honourable member, and he's already said I'm delighted it does.
Oh, what a glittering galaxy of stars from whom to choose. Mr. Neil O'Brien.
Very much for the personal compliment, Mr. Speaker. The former Liberal Democrat MEP Andrew Duff, who is the president of the very influential Spinelli Group of European Federalists, has responded positively to the Prime Minister's proposals this morning. He said that they are politically astute and they represent a potential landing zone for a deal. Now, does the Prime Minister agree with me that that is both positive, and also that those of us who are in this House who want a deal and want to avoid no deal now need to respond positively, engage with his proposals, rather than dismissing them out of hand without even having read the final text?
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, and I do think there are many people, actually, of all political persuasions, who are looking carefully at these proposals now and do see them as the way forward. And I remember Andrew Duff well, and very glad that these proposals are finding favour with him.
Jack Dromey.
Mr. Speaker, the world of work wants a deal to be done. But the problem with the Prime Minister's proposals are not just Northern Ireland. Moving as they do our country away from half a century of collaboration, close economic collaboration with our biggest market, in favour of a decade of economic uncertainty. But on Northern Ireland, after 40 years of war, there is peace. A terrible price was paid to achieve that. Nothing should be done which puts that at risk. And can I ask the Prime Minister a very specific question? On the movement of goods and his assertion that there will be no physical infrastructure, in his letter, reference is made to a small number of physical checks at traders' premises or other points on the supply chain. Where are they and what are they?
Well, they would be checks, Mr. Speaker, in the way that checks are already made for the purposes of invigilating trade in goods that are subject to excise at business premises or elsewhere. But they would be de minimis checks, and of course, on his substantive point about the peace process, I agree with him totally. I think the peace process and peace in Northern Ireland, as the Right Honourable Lady next to him has already said, it is one of the great achievements of our times. These proposals are designed to build on that peace process and to take it forward.
Alex York.
Can I warmly welcome these creative and constructive proposals, and also my right honourable friend's repeated offer to meet with members of the opposition to discuss them further, because we're all going to have to compromise across this House, and wouldn't all honourable and right honourable members do well to remember the aphorism that those who insist on absolute victory risk absolute defeat?
Mr. Speaker, that again speaks the voice of Cheltenham, and quite rightly, and I do believe that perhaps in this conversation this morning, people haven't paid enough attention to the move that the UK has already made. This is a very considerable advance that we're making in offering alignment in these areas. I think it's something that members do need to reflect upon, but it offers a way forward. If done by consent, I think it offers a very positive way forward, and I think the country will understand what we're trying to do.
Patrick Grady.
Speaker, he said Scotland was going to take back control of fisheries, so does that imply that he's going to devolve those powers to the Scottish Parliament? Because all of his interviews at the Conservative Party conference suggests he's intent on a power grab and taking powers and legislating here for issues that are actually already to devolve to Scotland.
Well, obviously, what we're proposing to do is to bring powers over UK fish back to the people of Scotland, and it is quite astonishing that the SNP continue to shrug off and to refuse the ability to run their own fisheries. Quite extraordinary.
Alex Shelbrooke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome my right honourable friend's approach since he's become Prime Minister to getting this moving forward? And indeed, can I thank my right honourable friend for spending well over 500, I believe getting close to 600 minutes at this dispatch box, answering questions to this House on this issue. And I believe he's approached it with statesmanship, workmanship and a scientific approach to get things done. So, Mr. Speaker, yesterday, when I backed my Prime Minister's deal, I got some, let's just call it, fruity questions on Twitter as to how I could be supporting the deal, having always wanted a deal. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that this is the way to get a deal? For those who want to leave with a deal, it's this compromise and it's moving forward. And those which were quick to bounce down to the media before even the political analysts had a chance to look at it, give the game away that they're not interested in a deal and they're not interested in honouring democracy.
I think that is, and I'm grateful to my honourable friend. I think, Mr. Speaker, it's quite likely that I will spend many more minutes at this dispatch box elucidating these matters, and I'm very happy to do so. But I think he's making the crucial point, which is that, of course, this House, many members of this House are opposed to no deal and what they see as the damaging consequences of no deal, even though, as I've tried to reassure the House, I believe we can greatly minimise those impacts. But I think it is, if members are opposed to no deal, then they really logically ought to support this as the way forward. I think it's very creative, it's very constructive, it takes the country forward and delivers on the mandate of the people.
Mr. Speaker, but the Prime Minister must recognise that this deal manages to put two borders on or around the island of Ireland, whilst at the same time significantly undermining the North East manufacturing and exporting economy and leaving our NHS and indeed our gorgeous landscape open to the depredations of the American big business. Isn't it just an attempt to put the blame for this ongoing Brexit shambles anywhere but where it belongs, with the Prime Minister?
Mr. Speaker, I had great pride in going to North Manchester General Hospital the other day and announcing. Forgive me. I thought she spoke of Manchester. Forgive me. Well, we are investing in the NHS around that. We're investing in the NHS in Newcastle as well, Mr. Speaker, and that is thanks to the hard work this government has done to repair the economic ruin of the Labour Party. And as for her assertion that we are somehow going to do a free trade deal with America that would expose the NHS, she is completely wrong in that it is the purest scaremongering, and she should take it back.
Jeremy Lefroy.
Mr. Speaker, would my right honourable friend confirm a couple of things to me? The first
is that this indeed is a backstop. It's a replacement backstop, but it is not the intention to have this, provided we can negotiate a full free trade agreement that would obviate the need for these particular arrangements. And secondly, that the withdrawal, the political declaration is indeed a political declaration. It doesn't have the kind of legislative force that the withdrawal agreement would have. And therefore, in a forthcoming general election, it's up to all parties to make the case for something Norway plus, Canada plus, whatever, but it's up to politicians to make that case so that if they form a government, they can indeed bring forward their particular version of a free trade agreement, free trade arrangements in the future.
Well, my honourable friend should know that this is, of course, not a backstop because we come out of the customs union. The whole of the UK is out of the customs union, and insofar as Northern Ireland remains temporarily aligned on agri-foods and on industrial goods, that is by consent. So there is no backstop. But he's absolutely right to say that these proposals offer the opportunity to do free trade deals around the world, and a very exciting prospect indeed.
Neil Coyle.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has recently admitted it was wrong to cut our police so much that 9 in 10 crimes went unpunished. His government is beginning to admit the massive faults with universal credit, and he's admitted the deep damage to the NHS. This unusual honesty is refreshing. So when will he get equally honest about Brexit and admit these plans would leave our country worse off, less secure, and risk the very future of the United Kingdom, and as such should never and can never be described as being in our national interest?
I think you will find that many members of his constituency voted to leave the European Union, and indeed the population as a whole voted to leave the European Union, Mr. Speaker, and their wishes must be respected. This House has voted time after time to honour the promise that we made to the British people. We can do so, and I believe, I'm absolutely sure, that we can achieve a glorious future by coming out with a deal of the kind that we're outlining today.
Michael Tomlinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Moses could have come down from the mountain with tablets of stone, and there would still have been those on the benches opposite who grumbled. But isn't it clear from today's exchanges, the grumblers are in the minority? Will the Prime Minister set out in due course some more of the detail of the political declaration that's so important in this case, and his vision for free trade agreements, not just with the EU, but across the world?
Yes, of course, and we will make sure that we set out what we want to do with the political declaration, but also with our ambitions for FTAs, and they are very considerable, Mr. Speaker.
Sarah Hobhouse.
Speaker, the Prime Minister is promising to get Brexit done at the end of the month. But the EU is not going to sink to the bottom of the sea, and as today's exchanges, nearly 2 hours long, have demonstrated, many questions are unanswered and nothing has been resolved. Rather than this being Brexit, getting Brexit done, isn't this Brexit never ending?
I may seize on that, Mr. Speaker, because I think that the Honourable Lady has it in her hands to help us all to get this thing over the line. This is the basis of a deal. It is not a deal. We have to get this agreed with our EU friends. It will not be easy. But if I'm able to return with a deal like this to this House of Commons, I hope, from what she has said today, that she will vote to get this thing done.
Immensely grateful to the Honourable Lady. Matthew Pennycook.
Grateful to you, Mr. Speaker. As with the Malthouse Compromise and the Brady Amendment, it's difficult to look at these proposals and not conclude that the benches opposite are almost exclusively talking to themselves. But taking the proposals at face value, does the Prime Minister accept that even if they do form the basis, however unlikely, for a deal, that there is no way that the arrangements set out in this new protocol can be put in place within 14 months, and so the logic of what he's proposing is an extension to the transition period beyond December 2020, with all the financial implications that entails?
I think that, if I may say so, Mr. Speaker, I think that is an excellent question and a relevant point. I'm happy to talk him through how we could satisfy all the objectives we have for the implementation period by the end of 2020 and to get to the state we want to be with our EU friends. He speaks about the need to converse cross-party. I'm more than happy to do that with him.
Verily.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The reality is that in supporting this hodgepodge of proposals, the absent Democratic Unionist Party has stood on its head as regards accepting a regulatory border down the Irish Sea. And this can only be because the looming no deal from the Prime Minister will be a disaster for Northern Ireland, which voted to remain. So could I ask the Prime Minister, isn't it time that the people of Northern Ireland, as well as the rest of the UK, were given a further vote with a much simpler option of remaining in the customs union and the single market being on the ballot paper? In opposing this, what is the Prime Minister afraid of?
Mr. Speaker, I think what the people of this country want is their democratic will respected, and what they want is to get Brexit done. And that's what we're going to do.
Angela Smith.
Speaker, the negative response this morning from both the business community in Northern Ireland and the majority of the political parties in Northern Ireland indicates the Prime Minister has got a great deal of work to do if he is to gain the consent of the people of Northern Ireland for his proposals. And does he not recognise too that if he fails to gain the consent of the people of Northern Ireland, he runs a significant risk of visiting damage on the Good Friday Agreement in both letter and spirit?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I appreciate that point, and she's absolutely right in what she did to emphasise the importance of getting consensus in Northern Ireland. But that's why we place so much emphasis in these proposals on consent, and that will be a key part of the discussions.
And Daniel Zeichner.
Speaker, from the discussions this morning, it's now no longer at all clear which parts of the political declaration the government actually supports. So I think it would be helpful to everyone if they could set out which parts still exist. And it's important because, for instance, the other day I was listening to the Universities Minister trying to reassure some of our senior researchers that we would stay close as possible to the European research frameworks, overseen ultimately, of course, by the ECJ. Is that still the government's position?
Of course, we will have a very close relationship with all European projects, whether it's on research or science or educational or whatever it happens to be. And I'm very happy in due course to share with the Honourable Gentleman and with the whole House where we are on the political declaration. The objective of the changes to the political declaration is really to set out the difference between this government's approach to the future relationship on trade and the customs union and our ambitions to do global free trade deals.
Drew Henry.
Mr. Speaker, could the Prime Minister outline his thinking over the principle of the Northern Ireland Assembly reviewing and voting on these arrangements every 4 years? Is it because if circumstances change, they have a right to change their minds?
Mr. Speaker, that is indeed the case, as he will understand. But if he invites me to draw an analogy with the people of Scotland, I just remind him that the people of Scotland were repeatedly promised that their referendum was a once-in-a-generation question.
In thanking the Prime Minister and colleagues, I would just say that there are issues of substance and issues of tone. The issue of substance of policy is absolutely not a matter for the Chair, but in respect of the tone, I would like to say that I think that the tone of yesterday's debate, very important debate on the government's domestic abuse bill, and the tone of the exchanges today represent a huge improvement on last week. And can I thank the Prime Minister and colleagues, if the right gentleman really thinks it's necessary, but we will take it. But point of order, Sir Peter Boston.
It's not necessary, but it's a courtesy to say we appreciate that your calm, quiet voice was just as effective as other voices you have.
Well, why didn't I realise just in advance how generous the honourable gentleman was going to be, and I thank him for what he said, which is very much appreciated. Minister, thank you. Okay, we now come to the backbench motion on women's mental health. To move the motion, I call Vera Hobhouse.
Mr. Speaker. Constituents often come to us at their lowest points, and we listen to them going through anxiety, depression and trauma. Poor mental health affects not only the individual, but everybody around them. Women are far more likely to experience serious mental health issues. Young women are at the greatest risk, with 1 in 5 having self-harmed and 13% having been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. Over the course of this Parliament, there has been a great deal of talk in this House around mental health, and that's progress. However, the opportunity to discuss women's specific needs when it comes to mental health services has been limited. 10 months after the publication of the Women's Mental Health Task Force final report, little has changed. There's a long way to go before our mental health services are working for women. There is now an obligation for government to step in and respond to the growing crisis in women's mental health with substantive policy.
Should give way?
I'm happy to give way.
I'm grateful. I very much welcome the work of the Mental Health Task Force and its report and the principles that were laid out in that report. But does she share my concern that those principles aren't going to be effectively implemented unless there's some clear targets and some concrete commitments from the government, and that the next stage needs to be a full women's mental health strategy with those targets and commitments in it?
I couldn't agree more. We need a strategy. More than half of women who experience mental health have a history of abuse, meaning that their conditions are rooted in experiences of gender-based violence. And we had a very